Chapter 178. The heavy rain spread from Dongdu to Zhongjing. It rained heavily all over the city. Torrential rain fell from the sky, covering the streets and alleys of Zhongjing and the long forest outside the city. There was water everywhere. The gloomy sky became dark as far as the eye could see, as if it was the end of the world. There was nowhere to escape, no way to retreat. The dense forest had become muddy because of the continuous rain. There was a faint light outside the forest, but it was still as dark as night in the forest. The dense shadows of the trees seemed to swallow the light, the branches swayed with the wind and rain, and the leaves were colorful. In the dangerous situation, the trees in the dark environment seemed to be making threatening gestures, revealing a kind of gloomy and ferocious feeling. In the dark forest wind and rain, someone retreated. Slowly retreated. The sound of footsteps mixed with the whistling of the wind echoed in the area from all directions of the forest. A steady voice sounded from the walkie-talkie with a tone that made people despair. East Control. West Control. South Control. North Control. The encirclement is complete. Requesting to close the net. With every sentence, the body of the person who was retreating would instinctively stagnate. When the last request to close the net sounded, he finally stopped. He was at least 2 meters tall like a giant, with a calm face. His upper body clothes had been completely torn, and the suffocating muscles of his whole body were exposed to everyone. Blood flowed down his thick arms and chest and fell to the ground in the heavy rain. He stopped, clenched his fists, and stared calmly at the group of figures moving in unison in front of him. Gradually, a fierce light like a raging fire lit up from his pupils, fierce and wild. There was a desolate killing in the dark rain. A man in his 50s stood in front of the giant-like figure. He wore a white robe, a white hat, and a pair of white boots. He was spotless, and the raindrops falling from the sky were blown away by an invisible airflow when they were 2 or 3 meters away from him. The man in white stood in the air, and his wrinkled face, which seemed to be full of kindness, had a twisted smile on it. He looked like a ghost. The game is about to end. The man in white smiled and said, "I have to say the game is very interesting, but I'm tired of it. You should go back with me. I can guarantee that you will be treated like VIPs. Of course, that is before you have any value." "Who are you?" the giant in front of the white-clothed man said in a low voice. His body stood ramrod straight in the rain, appearing particularly fierce and fierce. However, there was an unconcealable weakness and powerlessness in his voice. "I'm Byakuya," the man in white said indifferently, Limitless Palace's right guest. "You don't need to introduce yourself. I know you. You are Su Chu, the first disciple of the Jade Pool in the Central State. You're not bad. You haven't reached the Thundershocking realm, but you killed one of my trusted subordinates in the Thundershocking realm. You're all very good. Oh, let me see. The one beside you, if I am not wrong, is from Mount Shu in Zhongzhou State? Great Void Sword Master? I also know this person. He's from the Border Praetorian Corps. I have never seen these two ladies before, but I do recognize the future princess." White Knight's tiny eyes glowed with a strange excitement. "I have to say, you are the most valuable prey I've encountered recently. Smart and powerful. But it's a pity that you still haven't escaped from the hunter." There was silence. In the almost frozen atmosphere, Su Chu, who was standing in the front, took a step back calmly. Several figures that were blocked by his huge body or hidden in the darkness also took a step forward at the same time. The 6 people gathered together at once. They kept retreating. Although they knew there was no way back, it was not in their character to sit still and wait for death. A sneer flashed in Byakuya's eyes. He waved his hand slightly, and dozens of elites of the Limitless Palace behind him immediately followed him and moved forward. The frozen atmosphere became more and more oppressive, like a prelude to an imminent outbreak. "Be careful. Don't hurt our princess." A voice suddenly sounded beside Byakuya. In the crowd, a man in a bright red robe stepped through the crowd and directly appeared beside Byakuya. The wide red robe completely covered his limbs and head. The red robe was as red as blood, and the wide hem was fluttering in the wind. He was also floating in the air, but standing beside Byakuya, he didn't look like a person at all, but more like a piece of clothes floating in the air. "Of course." A disdainful look flashed in Byakuya's eyes and he said expressionlessly, "I won't hurt your princess, but you can't hurt the others here. Tianyu, take the people you want away later, and the others must go back to the Limitless Palace with me." The red robe floating in the air moved slightly as if it was nodding. The footsteps from all directions were getting closer and closer with the wind, and an oppressive momentum spread in the forest. Su Chu's face became more and more serious. He didn't know Byakuya, but he knew the red robe beside him. Tianyu, the high priest of the Ise Grand Shrine, was a real superior of the half-step invincible realm. In the past many days he had been the main force to hunt them down. The cause of the matter was completely inexplicable. They successfully killed their target during a hunting operation, and there was a young man in his 30s with the target. There was no mercy in this kind of war that concerned countries. Su Chu was completely instinctive and intended to kill the young man to keep his mouth shut. However, the young man who seemed to have no martial arts suddenly became violent and instantly injured Su Chu. At that moment, the fastest person to react was not Li Beidian and Ning Qianqing, but Dongqing Rushi, who had just joined them in the hunting operation. The two fought for a short time. Although Su Chu was injured, it was not fatal, and the young man whose strength was in the thunder-shocking realm successfully escaped the scene. From the beginning to the end, the young man only said one sentence. What's more, it was perfect Chinese. I'll remember you. That was the beginning of their nightmare. In less than 2 hours, the Divine Path forces of East Island, the Underworld, and the Special Warfare elites swarmed into action, from Ninghu to Juban and then to Zhongjing. The pursuers also changed from the fire-flaming realm to the thunder-shocking realm, and even Tianyu, the high priest of the Ise Grand Shrine, was sent. Until now, they didn't even know the specific identity of the young man. But it didn't matter anymore. If Tianyu's target was only Dongqing Rushi, then Bai Ye's target was everyone. It smelled like a conspiracy, which also meant that they were directly involved in the general trend of the two countries from the very beginning, from the original personal grievances. It was meaningless to think about other things. Breaking out of the encirclement was the only choice. But breaking out of the encirclement? Where could they break out of the encirclement? Senior brother, let's take a risk and go east. A weak voice sounded as if it was dying. If it doesn't work, just leave me here. Every one of us can leave. Su Chu's body shook. He turned around and looked at Ning Qianqing behind him. Ning Qianqing's face had begun to show the color of death. He held Yu Qingyan, who was in a coma, tightly in his arms and smiled reluctantly and weakly. I'm afraid I can't make it. As he spoke, he pushed Yu Qingyan, who was in his arms, towards Su Chu, and his voice grew weaker. Take care of her. And Rushi, I can't. I'm sorry, General. What the hell are you talking about? We're leaving together. Drunbility Ching Uf * King, hold on unless I die. Otherwise. Li Beidian grabbed Ning Qianqing's collar, but he paused in the middle of his words. Ning Qianqing seemed to smile reluctantly and fainted again. Carry Qingyan. Li Beidian gritted his teeth and carried Ning Qianqing on his back. He told Yi Huayu and said in a low voice, Go east, break out of the encirclement. You guys go. A clear voice suddenly sounded. Eldest senior brother, you take them to break out of the encirclement. I'll block them. You? Everyone turned around at the same time. A very young girl stood beside Yi Huayu. The girl looked to be in her 20s at most. She looked a little immature, but she was incomparably beautiful. She was slender and tall, more than 7 meters tall. Her black tights were somewhat torn, revealing a lot of white and tender skin. At this time she was supporting Yu Qingyan with Yi Huayu. Seeing everyone's eyes turn to her, she nodded and said seriously, I'll block them. The blood on her face could not hide her beauty. Her long black hair was not soaked by the rain but wantonly danced in the wind. Her eyes were calm and clear, but at this moment, there was an unshakable firmness in them. I can do it. This was an extremely beautiful girl with a focused and pure temperament. She stood in the night rain like a clear mountain spring, cold but with a temperament that could nourish everything. Elegant and noble, untainted by dust. Dongqing Rushi. Li Beidian slightly raised his eyebrows. Although he did not intend to retreat, he did not say anything. From the bottom of his heart, he was still a little dissatisfied with Dongqing Rushi. It was not because of anything else but because of her concealment. Yes, concealment. At least Li Beidian thought so. From Ninghu to Juban and then to Zhongjing for nearly half a month, they almost escaped the pursuit all the time. But Dongqing Rushi rarely made a move from the beginning to the end. Among the 6 people, everyone had a role. But when he thought about it carefully, Dongqing Rushi seemed to have never played any role. 3 days ago, Su Chu personally killed Leng Shui, an expert of the thunder-shocking realm from Wuji Palace. 5 days ago, Li Beidian and Yi Huayu joined hands to launch a sneak attack and seriously injured an expert of the thunder-shocking realm. 2 experts of the fire-flaming realm died under the sword of Mount Shu. Li Beidian and Yi Huayu were also seriously injured. 7 days ago, Su Chu personally led them out of Ninghu and into the territory of Juban. 10 days ago, Yu Qingyan. Yu Qingyan was the weakest in the team, but she contributed the most. Seriously injured Tianyu, an expert of the half-step invincible realm. No one could tell what was going on. 10 days ago, Tianyu appeared for the first time. He had a domineering momentum. Su Chu was at the forefront and the 6 people besieged him, but they were still no match for him. In the melee, Yu Qingyan, who had been wandering on the periphery, gave Tianyu a light blow when no one noticed. Then the high priest of the ISE Grand Shrine exploded. It was not his body that exploded but his blood. Countless drops of blood turned into blood mist, spraying from every part of his body with high temperature. Almost in the blink of an eye, Tianyu's strength dropped by at least a small realm. Tianyu, who was shocked and angry, had no intention to stay. He subconsciously counterattacked and turned to leave. But the counterattack that was supposed to kill Yu Qingyan was completely blocked by Ning Qianqing. After the battle, Yu Qingyan fell into a coma. Ning Qianqing was also seriously injured and dying. However, this battle also successfully made the pursuers have scruples. It was said that Tianyu was poisoned, but so far no one could tell what the poison was. With doubts in their hearts, the pursuers naturally wouldn't go all out to chase after them. Anyway, they had escaped for so long and finally reached Zhongjing. In Zhongjing, ISE Grand Shrine and Wuji Palace cooperated fully. Although the pursuit was intense, it seemed that the pursuers had given up the idea of taking their lives. For a few days they stubbornly held on, but now all their supplies had been completely exhausted, and their physical strength and willpower had been exhausted. Retreat? There was really no way out. And in the whole process, what did Dongqing Rushi do? She also attacked, but from beginning to end she didn't seem to draw her sword. A young expert who ranked above him in Zhongzhou State. A young expert who had reached the peak of the fire-flaming realm at the age of 19. Her role was even less than that of Yi Huayu. Li Beidian was not afraid of death, nor was he afraid of dying for his friends. But what Dongqing Rushi did really made him feel a little uncomfortable. No. Su Chu shook his head without hesitation. I'll stop them. You go. You can't stop them. Dongqing Rushi looked at Su Chu and said bluntly. Su Chu opened his mouth and his face changed slightly. You want to? It's really touching, but I'm sorry to tell you that none of you can leave. A gentle and elegant voice suddenly sounded. You now have 2 choices. First, come back to Dongdu with me as a guest. Second, go to Wuji Palace as a guest. A streak of blue lightning suddenly flashed in the rain. The lightning dispelled the darkness. In the extreme brilliance, the figure of a young man directly walked out of the lightning. Dongqing Rushi quietly looked at the lightning in front of her, blinked her clear eyes and didn't speak. Tianyu, the high priest of IC Grand Shrine, and Bai Yi, the right advisor of Wuji Palace, bowed slightly at the same time. Greetings, Your Highness. Your Highness. This was the honorific title for invincible realm experts in the Dark World, but it was not absolute. For example, Wang Yuatong, the little princess of the Wang family of Beihai, was often called Her Highness, the Palace Master. However, such a term could not be used casually. Those who were worthy of such a title either had absolute strength or had a status worthy of such a title. His Highness in Japan? Thinking of the princess that Tianyu mentioned just now, Su Chu and Li Beidian looked at each other slightly. Was this young man they met in the hunting operation a prince of the royal family of East Island? The young man nodded casually. He was wearing a very ordinary sportswear with short hair and an ordinary appearance. He was short like the men of East Island, and he didn't have any extra ornaments on him. But every move he made showed a kind of indescribable nobility. That was the temperament that was cultivated when he was in a respected position all year round, unattainable. What? Haven't you started yet? The young man asked casually. His tone was soft, but in the ears of Su Chu and Li Beidian, his tone became extremely rigid when translated by the translator. We're getting ready. Tianyu straightened up and said respectfully. The young man nodded casually and pointed at Dongqing Rushi. His eyes were a little hot. This woman, don't hurt her. From tonight on she belongs to me. I won't marry you. Dongqing Rushi looked at the young man who suddenly showed up quietly. There was no hostility in her eyes, only a pure concentration and seriousness that people couldn't see through. What? The young man was stunned, as if he had encountered something interesting. He said with a playful smile, maybe I should introduce myself. I'm Prince Renwu of the royal family of East Island. I can forgive your sins in East Island, and I'll even consider letting you be my princess. It's your honor. After all, I have to bear a lot of pressure to marry Ashina Sao as my princess. But you're very attractive to me. I won't marry you. Her tone was crisp. Dongqing Rushi repeated it again. She looked at Prince Renwu and said seriously, I have a fiancé. Prince Renwu raised his eyebrows slightly. Who is it? His tone was short, but he couldn't help but reveal a trace of gloominess. But then he thought of her identity, took a deep breath and calmed himself down again. The daughter of the commander of the border Praetorian Corps of Jianghu State. Getting such a woman was even related to the overall situation of East Island. Even if she wasn't a virgin, Prince Renwu was willing to accept her. I haven't seen him yet. Dongqing Rushi shook her head, and her clear eyes seemed to be a little wronged. I don't know if I can see him in the future. She raised her head, looked at the rainy sky through the dense branches and leaves of the trees and sighed softly. You guys go. She stepped forward and said. Junior sister? Su Chu opened his mouth and his tone was dry. We have no choice. Dongqing Rushi said softly. Her black hair danced wildly in the wind. She stepped on the breeze and stepped on the night rain. She reached out her hand. For many days. For many years. The long sword that she had been carrying on her back this whole time was gently removed by her slender hand. The name of the sword is Silence. She said softly, and her soft and almost ethereal tones spread in the forest. In an instant, the dense sword intent roared and surged, covering the forest. This was the sword of Jade Pool. The sword of Jade Pool was also Dongqing Rushi. In the mountain wind and the night rain, a trace of extremely bright fierceness suddenly flashed in Dongqing Rushi's eyes. Silence was about to be unsheathed. I'm in a desperate situation and so is the enemy. Chapter 179. Prince Renwu took a step back subconsciously, looking serious. The famous sword Silence? He looked at Dongqing Rushi who was walking forward step by step and asked seriously. There were 12 murderous weapons in the Dark World, but there was no ranking list of famous swords. Although there was no ranking list, Silence was definitely one of the famous swords in the Dark World. In the past 500 years, there had been 6 superiors of the Invincible Realm in Jade Pool, and all of them were known as the most powerful grandmasters of swordsmanship in the Dark World. Among the 6 superiors of the Invincible Realm, 3 of them used the famous sword Silence as their personal sword. The most recent superior of the Invincible Realm in Jade Pool died 20 years ago. After he died, Silence was really quiet. The Dark World was forgetful, but it also respected the strong. 20 years, an era people might forget the name of the superior of the Invincible Realm, but Jade Pool still stood in Jianghu State, and the reputation of Silence would not disappear. This was one of the 3 famous swords in Jade Pool, and now it appeared in Dongqing Rushi's hands. How could people not feel strange? This was not something that could be explained by underestimating Dongqing Rushi's status in Jade Pool. Such a famous sword, which was related to the rise and fall of Jade Pool, was in the hands of a young disciple. It was surprising, but it also made people feel a trace of strange danger. Dongqing Rushi was still moving forward. The terrifying sword intent kept spreading in all directions with her as the center. The sound of wind and rain in the forest gradually faded away, and only the sound of the sword intent breaking through the air was whistling up and down, echoing in the whole darkness. She reached out to hold the sword. At this moment, Dongqing Rushi looked even more pure and flawless. She seemed to be exuding a feeling that she was one with heaven and earth, elegant and sacred, with a trace of unattainable majesty. What? But it suppressed everything. Is she really at the peak of the fire-flaming realm? Li Baidian, who was carrying Ning Chenqing on his back, carefully looked at Dongqing Rushi's back, and suddenly looked back at Su Chu, asking with a serious face. In his sight, Dongqing Rushi seemed to be completely wrapped by the sword intent. Her flying long hair, her tall and slender body, and her graceful figure seemed to have disappeared in the sword intent. Or in other words, she was completely integrated with Silence. It was impossible to describe the feeling in his heart. Dongqing Rushi still seemed to be Dongqing Rushi. There was no soaring momentum, no sharp edge, but Li Baidian could clearly feel that she was different now. It was hard to tell exactly what was different. It was not a particularly dangerous feeling, but it was extremely heavy, pressing down on the depths of one's heart, as if there was some kind of unbearable magic. She is. Su Chu said in a low voice. The first senior brother of the Jade Pool, who could face anything calmly and resolutely at any time, now looked a little gloomy, helpless, sad, and determined. But that sword is not. What? Li Baidian was stunned. In your eyes, who is Rushi? Su Chu looked at Li Baidian and suddenly asked. Genius. Li Baidian simply gave a very accurate evaluation. A 19-year-old expert at the peak of the fire-flaming realm was definitely a genius. He paused for a second as he thought of Yao Qi and added, a genius in sword principle. Su Chu looked at him deeply and suddenly said in a low voice, "You're right. But do you know that when Rushi entered Jade Pool at the age of 6, she was in charge of the famous sword Silence at the age of 8? She wielded the famous sword Silence at the age of 8. She's 19 this year. She hasn't drawn her sword even once in 11 years? Su Chu took a deep breath and said heavily, "Not even once." Li Baidian was stunned. Dongqing Rushi, the well-known genius in sword principle of Jade Pool in Zhongzhou State, had never used a sword since she started martial arts? This news was really shocking. Even though he was in a desperate situation, Li Baidian still couldn't come to his senses. Accumulating strength to nurture a sword? Li Baidian asked. This method was magical but not unbelievable. Martial arts was a mysterious world with countless secrets. In the past countless years, a large number of geniuses had created countless methods to break through to the invincible realm. Li Baidian had never heard of this method, but it didn't mean it didn't exist. It's communication and integration. After correcting Li Baidian, Su Chu didn't continue. There were even some things that even he didn't understand. People had sword intent. Swords had sword energy. And Jade Pool had swords. For many years, Dongqing Rushi had been quietly cultivating in the Jade Pool. She didn't act like she didn't want anyone to get close to her, but she rarely communicated with others. Su Chu was the eldest senior brother. He knew that this junior sister was communicating and merging. But even he didn't know whether she was communicating and integrating sword or sword energy. But there was one thing he didn't tell Li Baidian. For nearly 200 years, there were 4 people in charge of Silence, and 3 of them were experts in the invincible realm. And Dongqing Rushi. The 4 people all practiced the same sword principle. It was the sword and unique skill that ran through time. They were of the same origin. Can she stop Tianyu and Bai Yi? Li Baidian took a deep breath and finally focused on the situation in front of him. He asked in a low voice. Yes. Su Chu said simply, because she has Silence. In the hands of others, even in Jade Pool, Silence was just a sharp, famous sword. But in Dongqing Rushi's hands, it was the sword intent that ran through time and years. Dongqing Rushi was at the peak of the fire-flaming realm. But Silence was not. But she will die. The best result is that her foundation will be completely destroyed and she will be alive at most. Su Chu continued. Li Baidian fell silent. From Su Chu's tone, he could totally hear how slim the hope of the so-called best result was. He smiled. It's not my character to abandon my teammates and run away. Even if you will die. Even if you will die. He put Ning Qianxing on the ground and handed him to Yi Huayu. His eyes were full of calmness when he looked at Su Chu. Su Chu's determined and calm face seemed to soften a little in the darkness. He nodded, turned around and strode toward Dongqing Rushi. He said softly, "Yes, even if I will die." Dongqing Rushi was still moving forward. The awe-inspiring sword intent had completely twisted the air around her. In the darkness, her figure was faintly discernible, but the holy and flawless temperament became more and more distant. It seemed to be out of instinct. Prince Renwu stepped back again. Bai Yi was stepping back. Tianyu was also stepping back. He was stepping back unconsciously. The sword intent that covered the whole forest didn't seem dangerous or murderous, but it seemed to have an irresistible momentum. You can't escape. In the blurry sword intent, Dongqing Rushi's clear voice rang out. Her figure was almost completely gone, but everyone could imagine how she looked like when she was talking seriously. Escape. Prince Renwu suddenly came to his senses. Until now, he didn't realize that he was stepping back. Not only him but all of them were stepping back. They didn't know how long it had been, but as this woman moved forward, they had stepped back at least 50 meters. The prince's gentle expression suddenly became cold, and a ferocious and violent emotion flashed in his eyes. Then he calmed down again. Maybe it's me who is most suitable to say that. There are many of you, Dongqing Rushi said softly. Dongqing Rushi said softly. The sword intent in the forest seemed to be getting sharper, but her tone was still clear and a little sad. But it's useless. Prince Renwu sneered even more. 3 superiors of the thunder-shocking realm, one of whom was a half-step to invincible realm, and hundreds of elites were forced to step back dozens of meters by a girl who was less than 20 years old. This was simply a great humiliation. The prince didn't want to say anything more. He had to do something to prove himself. He took a deep breath, took a step forward, waved his hand suddenly and shouted, "Catch them." The elites of East Island, who were ready to close the net, had already rushed out before Prince Qin's voice faded away. At least 100 elites rushed out from different positions, and ice walls rose up one after another in the night rain. The killing intent was getting closer. The enemies were getting closer. Why don't you retreat? Dongqing Rushi's figure seemed to be blurred, but her pure voice rang in Su Chu and Li Baitian's ears. Why should I leave? Li Baitian held the great void sword in his hand, and as the long sword shook, his laughter became unprecedentedly arrogant and heroic. Kill the enemies. Amidst his maniacal laughter, his figure suddenly became illusory. The great void sword pointed straight at the night sky. A tiny and weak flame lit up at the tip of the sword. All of a sudden the flame started to shake violently. Then it spread rapidly. The flame was still a flame, but layers and layers of hot air waves suddenly appeared in the air. They were invisible and intangible, but they instantly evaporated the ice around them. The hot and illusory sword intent spread out wildly in the night rain. It seemed illusory and real, and it was everywhere. A vast and heavy sword intent suddenly fell to the ground from the sky. Endless firelight suddenly burned in every corner visible to the naked eye. Su Chu was expressionless, but he flew up like a fierce tiger, rushing straight to the crowd without any detour. The sword intent mixed with the firelight was extremely condensed in the air, one after another. It was like a storm, like a wild thunder. The sword intent broke the ice walls on the ground, and smashed the East Island elites hiding behind the ice walls into the ground. That was an almost endless power, grand and heavy. The unique technique of Jade Pool. The roaring sword of wind and thunder. Kill the enemies. They were in a hopeless situation. If they didn't want to leave, what else could they do but kill the enemies? The result? They didn't want to do what they didn't want to do, which meant they were ready to face the worst result. Everything was meaningless. They could only kill the enemies. They could only kill the enemies. The fire rose under the curtain of rain. The sword wills of Jade Pool and Mount Shu blended and spread. The moisture in the muddy forest was evaporated instantly. The cracked ice, the flying blood, and the fallen trees were almost completely destroyed at the same time. Within a radius of dozens of meters, there was nothing but scorched earth. Dongqing Rushi stopped. She didn't look at Prince Renwu or the battle beside her. She just lowered her head and looked at the sword in her hand quietly. The body of silence was simple and slender. The only thing different about it was that the shape of the hilt was different from the usual longsword. The hilt of silence was flatter and slender, looking very elegant and smooth. This was the sword that the three invincible realm experts of Jade Pool used to carry. This was the famous sword that represented the strongest kendo of Jade Pool. Dongqing Rushi's eyes were focused. In her sight, the firelight that kept lighting up was fluctuating and twisting in the forest. In the brightening light, the body of silence seemed to shake a little. Crack! A tiny crack appeared on the sheath of silence. Dongqing Rushi's beautiful and holy face suddenly turned pale. Boom! The sword intent that covered the whole forest suddenly made an exploding sound. With silence as the center, the surging sword intent burst out like a mountain flood. In the loud bang, Dongqing Rushi suddenly screamed. Her clear voice twisted and spread with the sword intent. Without a sound, all the trees within a radius of 100 meters were blown apart. The invisible sword intent swept through all the ice walls nearby. The ice walls collapsed and the ice pieces flew. The whole forest looked like it was the end of the world. All the elites of East Island disappeared. Only the exploding flesh and blood were floating in the air. Let's go together. Kill her. Prince Renwu's face changed dramatically. In the nightmarish scene in front of him, he could only feel death and despair. The position of the princess. The border Praetorian Corps of Jianghu State. The future situation of East Island. Everything disappeared in his mind. Only by killing Dongqing Rushi could they live. Or in other words, only by destroying the sword could they live. At this moment, Dongqing Rushi's figure seemed to have disappeared completely. The sword energy between heaven and earth crazily gathered toward the body of silence. The sheath of silence was full of cracks. The ancient long sword was spinning crazily in Dongqing Rushi's hand, emitting a crazy light. This sword seemed to come alive all of a sudden. Tianyu and Bai Ye's faces also changed dramatically. Without any hesitation, the three of them rushed to Dongqing Rushi wrapped in the dazzling lightning. Dongqing Rushi's eyes were almost peaceful and quiet. Her face was like jade, and her sword intent was like a rainbow. She knew the consequences of this sword strike, and naturally she also knew the power of this sword strike. For countless years, the people who held silence had to practice the same unique technique. The unique technique of the same origin, the same sword, and the sword intent that ran through it. They merged with each other. To some extent, Dongqing Rushi was walking on the path that the three seniors of the invincible realm had walked on, the smoothest path without any detours. That was why her realm could improve so fast, because there was no bottleneck at all. Silence, the sword intent that belonged to the three seniors in the sword, was her martial arts, the martial arts that could directly enter the invincible realm. This was her secret. Over the years, her realm of martial arts had been increasing with the constant understanding of the sword intent of silence. If nothing went wrong when she completely understood the sword intent of silence and the unique technique of Jade Pool, she might be 30 or 35 years old. When she drew the sword, she would instantly rush into the invincible realm. But now it was not enough. Far from enough. It was enough for her to draw the sword by force with the strength of the peak of the fire-flaming realm. Silence was her martial arts road to the invincible realm, but in a desperate situation, it was also her strongest trump card. Killing enemies, killing relatives, and killing herself. She ignored the enemy in herself. She completely integrated her mind into the sword, and completely detonated the sword intent that belonged to the three seniors of the invincible realm. Not for climbing martial arts, but for killing enemies on the spot. This was the most tragic way. It was equivalent to using silence as a bridge to forcibly borrow the strength of the three seniors of the invincible realm. To some extent, this move was similar to Samsara in the 24 moves of Sword of the Li family, but it was more radical. A sword was drawn. The sword was destroyed and the person died. But in exchange it was a real attack of the invincible realm. No one could resist this sword, not Tianyu, not Bai Yi, not Su Chu, not Li Beidian, not Dongqing Rushi herself. I am in a desperate situation and so is the enemy. The cracks kept spreading in the surging sword intent. Dongqing Rushi, whose face was pale and bloodless, held the hilt tightly and drew the sword. Stop. A furious roar suddenly sounded from the distant sky, and it was spoken in Chinese. Did the reinforcements of Zhongzhou state arrive? But it was too late, it was too late. The sheath began to fall off. Dongqing Rushi's body was already out of control. She put more force into her palm. The blade suddenly came out of the sheath. The air suddenly became extremely quiet. The fire, lightning, and broken ice all disappeared in an instant. Only a misty cyan light that had been sealed for countless years flew out of the blade. That was the extremely powerful sword intent, and it was the purest cyan sword light. The sword light flew everywhere, dispelling the darkness in an instant, as if the whole world was blooming crazily. The unique technique of Jade Pool. The invincible sword of all paths. This was also one of the sword momentum that Dongqing Rushi majored in. The invincible sword of all paths, the invincible sword of all paths. Dongqing Rushi tightly pursed her lips. In the illusory scene before her death, a figure seemed to appear in front of her. In a trance, Dongqing Rushi saw a pair of eyes. The eyes were very complicated, very soft, and somewhat familiar. Crack. The unsheathed silence was forced back into the sheath. The sword intent that belonged to the invincible realm seemed to be unwilling to give up and burst out crazily. But the hand that was pressing the hilt could not be resisted. Bit by bit, the unsheathed blade was forced back. Dongqing Rushi's body was completely out of control. She felt that someone held her palm, and then her whole body flew into the air uncontrollably. The unparalleled sword intent completely dissipated, and it turned into another sword. In the clear sound of the sword, Dongqing Rushi held silence tightly, but it seemed that someone directly took the long sword out of the sheath for her. The misty cyan light disappeared completely. Dongqing Rushi flew into the sky. In the vast night, the rain was still falling and the bright moon was rising. That was a scene that was enough to be remembered for a lifetime. It was unforgettable. In the rain, the snow-white sword light flew up, clear and holy like the bright moon. Dongqing Rushi's long hair danced, and her delicate body stretched in the air. She stabbed down from the extreme point of the moon-like sword light. The person and the sword and the person, merged into one in the light. She was extremely beautiful. At this moment, Dongqing Rushi seemed to be able to topple the whole world. Chapter 180. It seemed to be rising and falling at the same time. The sword light was like a bright moon, rising in the curtain of rain. The whistling sword light intertwined in the air, stirring up the wind and clouds and stirring up the night rain. Under the clear sword light, the vast sword intent poured out unscrupulously. The unique technique of Jade Pool. The flying fairy from outer space. Under the sword light, the silent sword was still dazzling, but Dongqing Rushi became the only one in the world. She held the sword and flew into the air. That was an indescribable elegance and beauty. Like the morning dew, like the wind and mist, like a dream out of this world. This was an unreal sword move, not to mention the sword move, but only the elegance, it was unparalleled in the world. The world was like a misty painting covered with dust. An immortal came into the world and he and the sword became one, breaking through the painting. The sword couldn't be polluted, and the sword intent couldn't be blasphemed. Dongqing Rushi's figure fell from the sky. The sword light and the sword, the person and the sword energy merged together in an instant. Like a rainbow crossing the sky. The bright moon in the sky spread and condensed. From the top to the bottom, there was only one beam of light left between heaven and earth. That was the sword intent that completely surpassed the fire-flaming realm, and only the sword intent. The person and the sword fell to the ground suddenly. The messy light and shadow spread all over the sky, and a large number of East Island elites nearby were blown away by the impact of the sword intent. The whole scene became twisted and blurred. The aftermath of the sword light gradually calmed down. 3 figures rushed into the forest at an extremely fast speed. In their sight, a large number of East Island elites had fallen down, and the formation was a mess. Su Chu, Li Baidian, Yu Qingyan, Yi Huayu, and Ning Chenxing were all there, but now they all fell on the ground and passed out. Dongqing Rushi stood there with the sword in her hand, but her delicate body was shaking slightly, facing Prince Renwu in front of her. Prince Renwu's clothes were almost completely torn, and a lot of blood came out of his body, making him look like a bloody man. He stared at Dongqing Rushi in front of him, and besides anger, there was only fear and abnormal brutality in his eyes. The extremely gorgeous sword light disappeared around them. Dongqing Rushi's beautiful big eyes dimmed down completely. She tried to blink and stared at Prince Renwu fearlessly. I won't. I have. Her voice was very soft, getting softer and softer. Finally, before she could finish her sentence, her body fell backwards. A pair of strong arms caught her from behind. The movement of the owner of the arm was a little stiff, and he did not take the opportunity to hug her. Dongqing Rushi was in a daze. She tried her best to widen her dim but still exquisite eyes. In his line of sight was the face of a young man. It was a very ordinary face, but his eyes were extremely deep and gentle. This was a face that she had never seen in person, but she had seen countless pictures of. It was a name that he had heard countless times since he was young. His grandfather said it, his grandmother said it, his father said it, and he was still saying it now. It was a name that had almost been implanted in his soul and blood. His own? Li Tianlan? Dongqing Rushi blinked, looked at the young man in front of her, and asked softly. Li Tianlan nodded. He looked a little embarrassed, but he just held Dongqing Rushi and didn't let her fall. He couldn't let go of her, but he couldn't not let go of her either. Sorry we're late, he said dryly. Dongqing Rushi shook her head, stared deeply at Li Tianlan and looked into his eyes. He was of average height and he seemed to be relatively thin. There was nothing special about his face, and his hairstyle was relatively ordinary. His eyes seemed to be the most attractive part, but if one didn't look carefully, it was hard to find anything special about him. Sure enough, he was a little ordinary. Dongqing Rushi thought quietly and suddenly said, "Am I ugly now?" As he said this, he subconsciously touched his dirty little face. No. Li Tianlan froze for a moment and told the truth. Dirty and ugly were 2 completely different concepts. After fleeing and fighting for many days, it would be strange if Dongqing Rushi could be clean. But now Dongqing Rushi, who looked like a little tabby cat, was not ugly at all. Although she was covered with dust, the beauty under the dust was more obvious. I must be ugly. You won't even hug me. Dongqing Rushi muttered softly, reached out 2 small hands, and was about to climb on Li Tianlan with a serious face. I'm very tired and I want to take a rest. Hug me. Li Tianlan's mind was in a mess. Looking at Dongqing Rushi's serious and clear eyes, he subconsciously put a little force in his arms and carried Dongqing Rushi horizontally. This scene seemed to be a little wrong? Li Tianlan didn't know what kind of scene was normal, but the scene in front of him didn't conform to any of his guesses at all. It seemed strange. He lowered his head. Dongqing Rushi squinted comfortably in his arms. She looked around, intentionally or unintentionally. The scene was clearly divided. It seemed that there were only enemies and their own people. A doubt flashed in Dongqing Rushi's eyes. Then she pointed at Prince Renwu not far away and said seriously, "This is Prince Renwu of the royal family. He wants to marry me, but I told him that I have a fiancée. You have to be careful." Li Tianlan raised his eyelids. In his sight, Prince Renwu's blood had solidified, and his wounds had stopped bleeding. His body also seemed to be covered with a thin layer of blood-colored ice. The heat inside the thin ice rose up, and with a muffled sound, the thin ice covering her body exploded instantly. Prince Renwu walked out of the flying ice pieces with a pale face. There were still some blood stains on his torn clothes, but the blood stains had already dried up and he looked refreshed. Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes. The two looked at each other. A strong killing intent and mockery flashed in the prince's eyes, and there seemed to be some vague excitement. But when he saw Dongqing Rushi in his arms, all the emotions in his eyes suddenly turned into killing intent. Li Tianlan twitched the corner of his mouth. He moved and appeared next to Duke. "How are you?" he asked in a short tone. He asked about the injuries of Ning Qianqing and the others. Although he sensed that they were just in a normal coma, it was obviously more effective to check them in person than to sense them. "There's nothing wrong." Duke's tone was a little doubtful and puzzled. "They just passed out, He hesitated and pointed at Ning Qianqing. "There's something wrong with him. His injury seems to be serious, but his vital signs are stable. I don't know how to say it. His injury is real, but now it looks like he's just a little injured." Li Tianlan breathed a sigh of relief and said softly, "It's good that he's fine." Duke still looked doubtful. He looked at Dongqing Rushi and suddenly said, "Miss Dongqing, was it you who used that sword move just now?" Dongqing Rushi nodded in Li Tianlan's arms. "But that's the sword intent of the invincible realm." Duke looked serious. Li Tianlan's heart moved a little and he looked down at Dongqing Rushi. "It's the sword intent of silence," Dongqing Rushi said softly. "Silence sword." Duke looked a little enlightened but at the same time confused. His eyes subconsciously fell on the ancient sword in Dongqing Rushi's hand. The scabbard of the ancient sword was already full of cracks. It looked like it would break at any moment and reveal the sword. However, the scabbard that was full of cracks did not break. It was as if it had been glued together. Duke was a little confused, but he also knew it was not the right time to ask. He shook his head and stopped talking. "I'm sleepy," Dongqing Rushi said softly and closed her eyes in Li Tianlan's arms. Before she fainted, that pair of eyes seemed to appear in her mind again. That pair of soft, complicated, deep and vicissitudes of life eyes. That arm suppressed the unparalleled sword intent that she was about to break out. The invincible strike was destroyed, and the unparalleled sword intent was transformed into Jade Pool's unique skill, Heavenly Fairy. At that moment she wasn't the one using the sword. Instead, that arm was controlling her body and transferring the sword intent of Silent Sword. To put it simply, that sword move was not her own strength at all. Her consciousness became more and more hazy. Who was he? Where was he? With doubts, Dongqing Rushi struggled and finally fainted in Li Tianlan's arms. "Horsewoman!" Li Tianlan suddenly shouted. Horsewoman, who was taking care of the unconscious wounded, turned around and looked at Li Tianlan. "Take care of them." Li Tianlan handed Dongqing Rushi to Horsewoman and said in a calm tone. In front of them, Prince Renwu's gentle and playful voice rang out, sounding quite playful. Renwu pays his respects to the two super masters of samsara. He spoke fluent Chinese, looked at Li Tianlan who was walking over slowly and said with a smile, "Oh, and Mr. Li Tianlan, I've heard a lot about you. The East Island royals have been more and more shameless in recent years." Duke shrugged slightly, looked at Prince Renwu and said disdainfully, "You want to use Dongqing Rushi to influence Dongqing Wudi? And then control the border Praetorian Corps? Old tricks, when have you ever succeeded? That's because they don't know what's good for them." Prince Renwu said blandly, "It's their honor to be a relative of the royal family. A Shina woman," he pointed at Dongqing Rushi and said, "I admit she's beautiful. I gave her the honor to be a princess, and her family should also serve the royal family. Is there anything wrong with that?" "Idiot." Duke curled his lips and said, "Do you deserve to be called the royal family? You're always playing crooked tricks and you don't have any boldness at all. What a fucking royal family." Renwu narrowed his eyes, and a flash of anger flashed in his eyes. He suddenly took a few steps back and said with a smile, "Then how about I do something bolder for once? Like inviting the two super masters of samsara and Mr. Li Tianlan to the royal family as guests?" In the dark forest again, Prince Renwu smiled confidently and evilly. He looked at Li Tianlan and said in a low voice, "Dongqing Rushi is your fiancé? In the East Island Imperial Palace I'll personally make your fiancé my princess, and I'll let you watch the whole process with your own eyes, the whole process. Isn't it exciting?" Ah. The corner of Li Tianlan's mouth twitched, and his eyes suddenly became extremely cold. "Just by you." Duke sneered, and his eyes swept over and fell directly on the high priest of a grand shrine. "Tianyue, do you think you can stop me?" He turned his eyes to Bai Yi and said, "Do you think you can stop Horsewoman?" "Maybe I can't." Half of Tianyu's red priest robe was torn, but his tone was calm. But do you really think we're the only ones? Duke, long time no see. In the lingering sound of Tianyu's words, a deep voice suddenly sounded. A figure wearing an ordinary East Island elite combat uniform walked out of the dark. He walked slowly and took off the combat helmet on his head. Under the helmet was a standard European white face, with slightly bloated cheeks and dazzling blonde hair. A golden cross hung on his neck, shining brightly in the darkness. Holy light. Duke slightly raised his eyebrows and subconsciously narrowed his eyes. The deputy commander of Knights Templars in Northern Europe, codenamed Holy Light, a superior a half-step to Invincible Realm. Duke looked a little surprised, but he didn't panic. You chose to cooperate with East Island at this time? The union of samsara and heresy is the mortal enemy of Knights Templars. Holy Light said in a calm tone, you shouldn't stand with Dark Knights. The Duke sneered. In Jianghu State, Dark Knights showed their sincerity. In order to conspire with Jianghu State and samsara against East Island, on the day of the final battle, Dark Knights even sent out the murderous weapon Dark Saint's Spear, and became one of the main forces that trapped the commander of Knights Templars in Jianghu State. Did Holy Light come to East Island to cooperate with the royal family to take revenge on samsara? Didn't I tell you before? I especially hate your smiling face. Every time I see you smile, I want to kill you. A cold female voice cut through the darkness. Under the night sky, a woman with a graceful figure walked over. She was also wearing an ordinary combat uniform, but the slightly close-fitting combat uniform perfectly outlined her figure. She was graceful and alluring. Under the Duke's solemn gaze, the woman took off her helmet, revealing a delicate but extremely mature face. The Duke was expressionless. The woman threw the helmet at the Duke's feet and sneered, "What's wrong with looking at the helmet? I plan to use it to store your ashes and then throw it into the public toilet. That's how you samsara bastards should end up." Not a bad idea. The Duke said indifferently, "Why didn't I think of it when I killed your brother? If I throw Nimble Snake's ashes into the public toilet, it's a genius idea. Your brother won't have a chance to try it, but I will throw your ashes into the public toilet. Rattlesnake, you will like this ending." The woman was Rattlesnake. Before the destruction of Night Spirit, she was one of the top generals of Night Spirit, and her status was similar to the Duke in samsara. Rattlesnake's ranking in Night Spirit was even higher than her biological brother Nimble Snake, and her combat capability was no less than that of the Duke. However, on the night when samsara destroyed Night Spirit, Rattlesnake was seriously injured by Saint Duke, who was in charge of hunting down Rattlesnake, encountered the siblings. In order to cover Rattlesnake's escape, Nimble Snake died in his hands. The royal family of East Island, IC Grand Shrine, Wuxia Palace, Knights Templars and the remnants of Night Spirit. Tonight was really lively. Was it really a trap? Such a big battle, you just waited here for me? If I didn't come. Waited for you? Who do you think you are? Rattlesnake sneered and interrupted Duke. We are waiting for your current master. The Mikado and Chaos His Highness made a big bet for him. As for you? Do you think that anyone will care if you die? She looked at Duke with a cold smile, and then turned her eyes to Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan looked at her calmly. I don't like your face, Rattlesnake said with a disgusted look, and then she suggested viciously, Your Highness, kill Duke and Horsewoman and bring Li Tianlan back. Maybe you should seriously consider who your wife is. Dongqing Rushi and the Border Control Corps are good, but aren't Qin Weibai and Samsara a better choice? Prince Renwu's eyes suddenly lit up. Qin Weibai. She was truly a goddess-like figure. Would she be his princess? At this moment, Prince Renwu actually felt very honored. He knew that this plan was feasible. They might not be sure about Li Tianlan's position in the heart of the Master of Samsara Palace, but they were sure about Li Tianlan's position in Qin Weibai's heart. Capturing Li Tianlan would bring great benefits to the overall situation of East Island and Prince Renwu's future. In their plan, Li Tianlan was even one of the key points to instigate the Samsara. What do you think? Prince Renwu was tempted, and he actually looked at Li Tianlan, wanting to know his opinion with great interest. I think you're going to die. Li Tianlan looked at Prince Renwu with pity in his eyes, as if he was looking at a dead man. More and more elites of East Island gathered around, and there were at least hundreds of them. Enough elites, absolute superiors. Who could kill him? Duke glanced at the superiors in front of him, and then looked at the crowd around him. His expressionless face gradually showed a hint of a smile. Anyone else? He suddenly asked. Prince Renwu sneered. When he was about to give Duke another surprise, someone gave him a surprise. No more. A clear Chinese voice rang out in the forest, and it spread all over the place. Prince Renwu's face suddenly froze and he suddenly turned around. In his sight, a white shadow was getting clearer and clearer in the dark, and it was getting closer and closer. Everyone's eyes instantly focused on the man in white who was getting closer and closer. A man who was so handsome that people couldn't tell his age walked over slowly, and his smile was lazy with a kind of careless calmness. Li Tianlan slightly raised his eyebrows. At the first sight of him, Li Tianlan thought of someone. Daybreak. Both of them dressed in the same style, and both of them were extremely handsome, but their temperaments were completely opposite. Daybreak's temperament was strange and cold, and it was enough to frighten anyone. But the man in white in front of him had a sense of laziness all over him. He walked through the messy battlefield, but he was careless as if he was having a holiday by the sea. In his sight, the man in white seemed to raise his hand. In the whistling sound, a few ball-shaped objects flew over, fell on the ground and rolled slightly. Look, they're all here. They're really gone. Prince Renwu's face instantly turned livid. Others' faces also changed. Human heads. There were 4 of them and all of them were bloody human heads. They were the other 4 thunder-shocking realm experts who were lying in ambush in the forest. 2 of them were from the Divine Wind Force, 1 was from the Royal Family, and the last one was from Night Spirit. 4 thunder-shocking realm experts, plus the real experts like them and many elites. There was no reason for them to fail to encircle the 2 supermasters of Samsara. But right now, the heads of the 4 thunder-shocking realm experts were taken away without a sound. Prince Renwu felt cold all over. He suddenly raised his head, looked at the man in white in front of him and said coldly, "Who are you?" "Dawn." The man in white smiled and said, "I'm Dawn." Dawn broke. Li Tianlan murmured in his heart. After knowing the news about Li Badian and others, Duke had contacted the extremely mysterious ally of Samsara, and the other party also promised to send someone to pick them up. But who knew that it was such a super expert who came? The heads of the 4 thunder-shocking realm experts were still rolling, and the whole night seemed to become extremely cold and cruel. The atmosphere suddenly froze. Then it was instantly broken by a sharp scream. Kill? Beside Prince Renwu, Rattlesnake suddenly screamed and directly rushed to Li Tianlan. This was their most important goal tonight. They hunted for several days just for this moment. Almost at the same time, Tianyu and Bai Yi directly stood in front of Dawn. Holy light rushed to Duke. A large piece of blue light instantly bloomed in the forest. Rattlesnake's figure had directly rushed to Li Tianlan. In the curtain of rain, the wind suddenly rose. Li Tianlan's eyes focused, and a shadow had already appeared behind him. But before he had time to change his position, the wind had already roared. The wind instantly blew away Li Tianlan's shadow. At the same time, the lightning around Rattlesnake was also blown away. Rattlesnake's expression changed dramatically, and for a moment she didn't dare to move forward. In her perception, there seemed to be an irresistible force firmly locking her in the extremely distant sky. That force was cold and overbearing, with a momentum that could destroy everything. The wind rose but there was no sound. Strange whistling sounds were everywhere in the air. It was like countless unsheathed swords were flying in the sky, fierce and crazy. Sword intent. That was the sword intent that was so huge that it could cover the sky, and it was continuous. The almost invincible sword intent formed hundreds of meters away, and directly pressed over with a momentum as mighty as thunder. The whistling sounds in the air were getting louder and louder. Wherever the sword intent passed, countless turf and trees were all broken. Large pieces of debris were wrapped by the sword intent and flew straight to Rattlesnake. There seemed to be a storm that swept away everything in the forest. It was rampaging and the sword intent was like a dragon. Fast. The vast and heavy sword intent was like a flash of light. Before the whistling sound of the wind faded away. The sword intent mixed with large pieces of turf and trees had already swept the whole area hundreds of meters away. The wind stopped. The sword intent disappeared. In the silence, Rattlesnake stood where she was, and her beautiful face was full of horror. Under everyone's focused gaze, the remnant of the night creatures let out a shrill scream. There seemed to be infinite sword intent breaking out in her body. In an instant, blood and flesh were flying all over the sky. Chapter 181. The bloody mist flew into the air in the deep night, and the scream of Rattlesnake still lingered in the air. The grand sword intent that swept hundreds of meters in an instant had dissipated. Everything was so fast that it seemed to be an illusion. Only the bloody mist all over the sky proved what had just happened. Blood, flesh, bones, and internal organs. That domineering sword intent charged forward, and everything in its path was crushed into powder. Rattlesnake. Rattlesnake, who used to be the top general of Night Spirit, vaguely surpassed the peak of the Thundershocking realm and was infinitely close to the half-step invincible realm, was the first to bear the brunt of this peak sword intent. The night wind blew and the fine rain fell. The bloody mist in the air floated for a moment and disappeared directly. There seemed to be no trace of Rattlesnake in the whole forest. Insta-kill. And it was insta-kill from hundreds of meters away. Rattlesnake, who was close to the half-step invincible realm, burst into a bloody mist without the slightest ability to fight back. How terrifying was the person who used the sword. Saint. An extremely angry roar suddenly sounded. The broken red robe of Tianyu, the high priest of Iasi Grand Shrine, swelled violently. In the blink of an eye, the injury caused by the poison was forcibly suppressed by him. Tianyu's face was strangely pale, but his soaring momentum returned to the peak in an instant. About 3 years ago he had a fight with Saint in Dongdu. The extreme and aggressive sword intent was unforgettable. 3 years later, when the mighty sword intent swept over the battlefield and instantly killed Rattlesnake, he almost recognized the origin of the sword intent at once. Saint of Samsara Palace, the head of the 12 Supermasters, was one of the superiors of the half-step invincible realm who was closest to the invincible realm in the dark world. Half a step, 1 step, half a step, above the Thundershocking realm and below the invincible realm. The subtle gap was completely vast. Both of them were at the half-step invincible realm, but 1 step was enough to determine the winner. Tianyu, the high priest, was a superior of the half-step invincible realm. 3 years ago when he fought with Saint, he was defeated. Today, 3 years later, although his state did not decline, his body was weaker with the passage of time. Saint was not old, at least he still had a glimmer of hope to reach the invincible realm. Tianyu himself was faintly regressing. Saint, on the other hand, had been progressing by leaps and bounds. The gap between them would only get bigger and bigger. Therefore, before Saint got close to the battlefield, Tianyu directly suppressed the poison in his body. He forcibly raised his state to the half-step invincible realm at the cost of being seriously injured. Kill? Tianyu let out a wild roar. Without holding anything back, he stretched out his arms and made a hugging gesture. There was a faint sound of thunder in the air. A large area of air exploded around him, and the twisted airflow formed a tearing wind, sweeping up everything within a radius of more than 10 meters. An astonishing lightning suddenly lit up in his arms, and the lightning twisted and intertwined in his arms, instantly turning into a ball-shaped object. In front of Tianyu was the white-clothed Dawn. Beside him, Bai Yi was also dressed in white. All of a sudden the white robe disappeared. Bai Ye's body disappeared in an instant. The sharp sound of the sword cutting through the air rang out, and with a slight flicker of lightning, it rushed straight to the Dawn. Bai Ye's body disappeared, leaving only the sword intent in the air. Limitless Palace's secret technique. Dark ambush. This wasn't the most powerful move of Limitless Palace, but it was regarded as the real essence of what Tianhai Wuji had learned in his life. Tianhai Wuji was the most powerful saber grandmaster in East Island, but this move was the real sword raining move. The core of this move was dissipation. The sword intent condensed. The figure dissipated. In an instant, Bai Ye's figure seemed to really disappear from this world. Only the sword edge cut through the air and the sword light rolled down. Dawn didn't fight back and he couldn't. Under the dark ambush, Bai Ye's figure really disappeared. There was only his sword in the air and no attack could fall on him. The sword light and the lightning fell. A few meters in front of him, the light ball in Tianyu's arms suddenly exploded. There were surging lightning everywhere, swallowing and destroying everything. The lightning rushed over the place where Bai Yi was just now, and spread to all the surrounding space. It rushed over. This was one of the most powerful final moves of Iasi Grand Shrine. Dark Sacrifice. In the blink of an eye, Bai Yi and Tianyu attacked at the same time, and they used all their strength. The sword intent and the lightning shone in the sky, and the surging and violent killing intent directly covered Dawn in white. None of them were fools. Bai Yi and Tianyu weren't. Holy Light wasn't. Prince Renwu wasn't. Duke Horsewoman, Li Tianlan wasn't either. How was the power difference on the spot? Dawn was a real superior of the half-step invincible realm. Duke was also infinitely close to this level. Among the 12 super masters of Samsara, there was a jura between Horsewoman and Duke. Her strength wasn't as good as Duke, but it wasn't far behind. An ordinary expert at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm couldn't become one of the super masters of Samsara Palace. Li Tianlan was injured now, so his combat capability was the worst. But after taking the surge potion from North America, his strength would stay in the fire-flaming realm for 3 months. Tribulation's Buddhist incantation of 9 words, the Li family's map of God of War and Wind and Thunder veins, his capital was extremely strong. In this state, Li Tianlan could kill an ordinary superior of the thunder-shocking realm, and he could protect himself in front of an expert at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. As the enemy, East Island did have the advantage in strength. Tianyu and Holy Light from Northern Europe were both standard experts of the half-step invincible realm. Bai Yi wasn't weaker than Duke. Prince Renwu was also in the thunder-shocking realm. Although he hadn't reached the peak, his combat capability was definitely not bad. Plus, there were hundreds of East Island elites around. They had nothing to fear and were full of confidence. But the appearance of Saint instantly broke the power difference between the two sides. In the blink of an eye, the grand sword intent spanning hundreds of meters killed Rattlesnake with one strike. Such strength completely showed the strength of the first supermaster of Samsara Palace. Tianyu had passed the peak. Even Holy Light, who was still in the peak, thought that he couldn't do this. But everyone knew that Saint hadn't really reached the invincible realm. The sword strike just now, in terms of scene, wasn't even as good as Dongqing Rushi's flying fairy from outer space. But in terms of power, it was close to the strike of an invincible realm expert. Killing Rattlesnake from hundreds of meters away was definitely Saint's full effort. This seemed to be overbearing and chilling, but how could Saint not pay any price? At least he would be weak for a short time. Saint's weak state and the distance of hundreds of meters was the best chance for East Island. As long as they could catch Li Tianlan in this short time, even if Duke, Horsewoman, and the other young people didn't die, as long as they defeated them and caught Li Tianlan, their operation wouldn't be considered a failure. If they waited until Saint recovered from his weak state and rushed to the scene, it wouldn't be a problem of failure anymore. None of them would probably be able to leave. It was a race against time. For a moment, everyone in the forest went completely crazy and went all out. Tianyu and Bai Yi fought hard again. Holy Light was also fighting hard. As the leader of Knights Templars who came to East Island this time, his sense of urgency and pressure was no less than that of East Island. The reason was naturally because of Samsara. Samsara Palace. This was one of the most mysterious dark superpowers in the dark world. No one knew where their headquarters was, but they vaguely knew that they had a great influence in Europe. The headquarters of Knights Templars was in Northern Europe, and their biggest backer, the Vatican, was also in Europe. In the past few years, Northern Europe had always been the most lively place in the dark world. Knights Templars claimed to be the chosen ones of God, with the will of the Vatican, and regarded Dark Knights as heresy. Knight Spirit, whose headquarters was in Billy State, tried to fish in troubled waters. People of Samsara Palace appeared and disappeared from time to time, and it was unclear whether they were enemies or allies. The Wang family of Beihai, the Jianghu family of South America Fantasy World, and other large and small dark superpowers also had their own demands. In countless dark corners of Northern Europe, there were fights and killings almost every day. Now the dark world was going to change dramatically. Although the battlefield was in East Island, the starting point was also in Northern Europe. Night Spirit was destroyed. In the entire Northern Europe, the most deeply rooted superpowers were Samsara, Knights Templars, and Dark Knights. But on the day of the final battle in Jianghu State, Samsara and Dark Knights showed an unexpectedly close cooperative relationship, which made the whole Knights Templars nervous. If this situation continued, there would be no room for Knights Templars to survive in Northern Europe in the future. Mortal enemy. Being on the side of heretics meant being a mortal enemy. So, Holy Light came to East Island and stood in the camp of East Island to fight against Samsara and Jianghu State. This was a cooperation that concerned the overall situation. Holy Light's mind was extremely pure. For his ally he would go all out. He was moving forward. Duke was retreating. There were surging airflows everywhere. In the darkness, Holy Light's golden hair was shaking rapidly, and a dazzling light burst out around him. The faint blue electric arc went straight up to the sky, and Holy Light himself seemed to be plated with a layer of golden light. Holy and majestic. It seemed to be the power of faith, firm and unshakable. Heretics, go to hell. In the furious roar, Holy Light punched out. He didn't hide it at all. This was the martial arts of the Vatican. Holy punishment. Behind the Duke there were messy lightning bolts everywhere. The lightning bolts flickered and spread out with extreme power. Facing the Holy Light's divine punishment, The Duke retreated even faster, but the lightning bolts behind him suddenly stopped. Two thin but extremely dangerous electric arcs suddenly burst out from the thunderbolts behind him, vicious and cold. Thanks. Suddenly there was a trace of blood in the air. It was like the collision between holiness and evil. The indistinct golden and blood-colored electric arcs intertwined and collided. Blood flew out from Holy Light's shoulder, and Duke, who was a little weaker, was directly punched out. Holy Light, whose shoulder had exposed the ghastly white bones, had no pain in his eyes, only a kind of fanaticism that ordinary people couldn't understand. Heretics. In the roar, his body rose into the air, chasing after Duke, and he jumped down from the air. Unique technique, judgment. Duke was fighting. Horsewoman was guarding. Horsewoman, whose code name was Horsewoman, seemed to be more like a guardian. Several unconscious young people on the ground had been put together by Horsewoman. There were gunshots from all directions and all kinds of bullets swept all the areas around Horsewoman. In sight, one elite after another rushed up. Ice-condensing realm, fire-flaming realm. Their strength might not be strong, but the sense of oppression when they rushed up together was far more than that of a single thundershocking realm expert. The knight's expression was calm. Bright electric arcs with some sparks intertwined around her, forming an almost impenetrable electric net. Countless bullets hit the net and were melted without a sound. The elites around her were getting closer and closer. The light of the ice edge and the raging fire was faintly shining in her eyes, becoming clearer and clearer. Horsewoman took a deep breath. Looking at the elites getting closer and closer, she suddenly lowered her body. She clenched her fists. She clenched her fists, which looked very delicate, and punched the ground. Boom. The electric net around her exploded instantly, and countless electric arcs spread out, forming a natural circle. There were crackling sounds everywhere in the air, and the shock wave composed of pure electric light spread to every corner around. A large number of East Island elites were blown away as if they were struck by lightning. The electric light spread and then gathered. Horsewoman was expressionless, but her eyes were observing Li Tianlan intentionally or unintentionally. She could die, but nothing could happen to Li Tianlan. Horsewoman pursed her lips and her face looked cruel. Even she could die. At the critical moment, Duke, Don, Dongqing Rushi, Li Baidian, Ning Chenqing, everyone could die. Switch positions. The moment Rattlesnake's body exploded, Li Tianlan entered the strongest fighting state almost without any hesitation. Three shadows appeared almost at the same time, and the distance between them was shortened quickly. When Prince Renwu just came back to his senses from the shock, a silver spear had already struck Prince Renwu's head with an unstoppable momentum. Changing the princess? From today on, the royal family of East Island was going to change the prince. The lightning around Prince Renwu suddenly shone. Before he could fight back, the surging light suddenly stopped. Stop formula. The air suddenly became extremely twisted, and everything seemed to be confined. Li Tianlan's eyes were cold. After the stop formula, it was the crack formula. Several shadows followed his real body and rushed to Prince Renwu at the same time. But Prince Renwu's body had disappeared in an instant. Only the invisible sword intent approached Li Tianlan quickly, bursting out the blue electric light all over the sky. The unique technique of Wuji Palace. Dark ambush. Li Tianlan's expression didn't change at all. He still started with the crack formula, and the human emperor instantly turned into two swords. The raging fire surged up to the sky in an instant, and the forest seemed to be filled with raging fire. The eighth blade burns the sky. The surging lightning danced all over the sky. From the corner of his eyes, two figures in white seemed to appear in the large amount of falling lightning at the same time. In front of the figures in white, High Priest Tianyu, whose red robe was almost completely torn, had already flown out with a large amount of blood. The white clothes were stained with blood. Under Bai Ye's ambush, Don, who had taken almost all of Tianyu's attacks, was covered with blood. Some belonged to Bai Yi, some belonged to Tianyu, and some belonged to himself. The fiercest confrontation without any reservation. So the battle seemed to be over as soon as it started. Don's body shook slightly and his breath became weak. But Tianyu's body flew backward for at least 30 or 40 meters, fell on the ground and didn't make any sound. Tianyu, you're old. Don's eyes were cold. He looked at the place where Tianyu fell and said expressionlessly. Bai Ye's figure had already appeared. In a split second he seemed to have dodged all of Don's attacks, and his whole body was still in the most perfect state. But he didn't look very excited. Instead he looked more and more serious. When he joined hands with Tianyu, his power was almost equal to that of two half-step invincible realm experts. There was a gap, but it wouldn't be too big. But at that moment, this super expert who came out of nowhere didn't use any unique skill. The attacks he dodged seemed to be the most common ones. Who the hell was he? Where did he come from? Bai Ye's eyes were completely focused. Looking at Dawn's weak and tired face, he looked serious and raised the long and narrow samurai sword in his hand. A touch of green light bloomed on the blade of the samurai sword. In a split second, there seemed to be a strong wind whistling, blowing up Bai Ye's white robe. He raised the sword. He sprinted. The green sword light filled the nearby forest in the blink of an eye. The sword light suppressed all the lightning. Fast as lightning. Before the first sword fell, another sword was raised. It was an indescribable swiftness. Bai Ye's body was like a crazy demon. Not only the sword was fast, but also his speed seemed to suddenly increase, directly reaching the level of half-step invincible realm. The saber light flew out at a speed that dazzled everyone's eyes, covering everything in its path. Under the sword light, everything seemed to be destroyed. The strongest unique skill of Wuxia Palace. The fastest sword in the dark world. Chapter 182. There had never been a perfect unique skill of martial arts in this world. Imperfection was not a weakness, but it was a shortcoming in some aspects. Perfect was martial arts, and the so-called unique skill was the pursuit of power in some aspects of martial arts. For example, extreme speed, extreme explosive power, extreme sword energy, or extreme defense. In the process of pursuing the extreme, you had to give up something. When you couldn't take care of everything, then you could focus and reach the extreme. The map of God of War of the Li family was like that. The 6 paths of reincarnation of the Wang family of Beihai was like that. The unique skill of Wuxia Palace was like that. Dark ambush. The essence of this move was the ambush, but it was also the darkness. This was known as the quintessence of Wuxia Palace, and it was indeed amazing. When Prince Renwu's figure disappeared in front of him, Li Tianlan couldn't locate him at all. The figure disappeared, the sword light disappeared, and the lightning disappeared. Everything in front of him seemed to turn into nothingness in an instant, and only the killing intent was real. It seemed like there were countless swords chopping in the air, and the sharp sound came from far away. Prince Renwu's body became completely illusory, and the sound of the long sword chopping in the air suddenly became louder. The bright sword light flashed and a large amount of lightning poured down. Prince Renwu's figure was still nowhere to be seen. Li Tianlan couldn't understand the martial arts principles of such a unique skill, and he didn't bother to think about it. The lightning poured down from above, and the fire suddenly soared into the sky. The 8th blade of flaming sky. Right beside him. The 2 shadows moved at the same time. They raised their swords and spun. Under the wet rain, the air within dozens of meters suddenly became extremely dry. The flames rose on the ground and covered everything around. The sword light and the lightning intertwined. Looking from a distance, Li Tianlan seemed to be surrounded by a huge and expanding fireball. The moment the lightning and the fire intertwined, the fireball seemed to be greatly stimulated. After an extreme expansion, all the fire exploded. The fire was like a tide. The raging fire waves ravaged every corner within dozens of meters. Li Tianlan's face was cold, and his essence, qi and spirit were completely condensed. In a sense, this was the first time that he exposed his inheritance and unique skill in front of the world. In Huading, he used the 15th blade to kill Gu Changjiang, and Gu Changjiang was already dead. Black Robe's attack, the shattering of mountains and rivers, belonged to the domain of the invincible manual. That sword was also unknown. In Dongdu he killed Miyamoto Shiny Eye. Miyamoto Shiny Eye was already dead. In the face of my Shiranui's pursuit, even at the last moment, Li Tianlan still concealed something. The meteor fire shower of the 3 swords was completely deformed, leaving only an almost violent power, which would not let others see through it. Right now, the 8th blade burning heaven. The most complete and clearest sword appeared directly in front of everyone. That violent sword intent mixed with raging flames rose from the ground, pervading the heavens and earth, surging like a tide, like a huge wave. The ultimate sword intent was unprecedentedly clear, so clear that there was no concealment at all. That was the strongest sword intent in the entire dark world. 8th blade. There seemed to be faint golden lightning roaring. In an extremely short amount of time, Holy Light, who had already suppressed the Duke with his full power, suddenly turned around. His almost frenzied attacks also paused for a moment. This area of less than 200 meters was divided into several battlefields. Which one of the people present was not an expert? The moment the flames of the eighth blade rose, the familiar and strange sword intent had already swept across the battlefield. The unconcealed sword intent was so obvious that it was almost dazzling. Sure enough, the cold light in Holy Light's eyes flashed away. He muttered to himself. Before he could do anything else, Duke, who was more and more struggling in the battle and could only defend, suddenly pounced on him. His sight was full of blue. The blue and somewhat black lightning completely condensed in the hands of the Duke, like two sharp knives, and fiercely stabbed the chest of Holy Light. The lightning roared around him as he moved. It was raining, but the whole battlefield was as dry as a desert. The lightning exploded on the ground, splashing a lot of smoke and dust. In a blur, Duke's scarlet eyes were full of the purest evil and coldness. The two electric knives instantly cut through Holy Light's clothes. Then he continued to move forward. Unique skill, bloodthirsty. The whole battlefield was moving. Horsewoman was responsible for guarding the wounded. A large number of East Island elites pounced on her one after another. The range of Horsewoman's activity was getting smaller and smaller, but the lightning around her was getting denser and denser. More and more East Island elites fell on the way of the charge. Horsewoman's dignified face gradually turned pale. When her willpower was exhausted, her physical strength and combat effectiveness began to plummet. That was the saying, ants can bite an elephant to death. Bai Yi and Tianyu teamed up to besiege Dawn. In an instant the outcome was clear. Tianyu flew backward with a lot of blood flying around. But Bai Yi, who was close to him, seemed to have fallen into madness. The mountain fell and the earth cracked. The dark green saber light spun and splashed in the battlefield. The strong airflow drove the roaring lightning, which had almost completely covered Dawn. Fast. Pure fast. It was indescribably fast. Every strike seemed to be fatal. This was the strongest unique skill of Wuji Palace. It didn't look fancy, even a little simple, but the fast and violent blade was enough to cut everything. It was the perfect combination of strength and speed. It was steady, accurate, ruthless, invincible, and unbreakable. Two white shadows intertwined with each other, one advancing and the other retreating. Fast. Faster and faster. Dawn's pupils had become completely bright. He had completely put away his previous careless attitude. Facing the blade that had vaguely surpassed the peak of the thunder-shocking realm, he didn't even have the slightest defense when he advanced and retreated. He moved like a flying dragon. He didn't have any weapons, but his body was full of weapons. Bolts of lightning surged in front of him one after another, turning into giant sabers and long swords. The weapons condensed from lightning shot toward Bai Yi without hesitation, accurately blocking each of his sabers and then continuing to attack his body. Bai Yi seemed to be attacking wildly, but in fact he was already in a semi-defensive state. But Dawn didn't defend from the beginning to the end, he just attacked wildly. It was an incomprehensible momentum, crazy and fanatical, and he wouldn't retreat until he died. While advancing and retreating, Bai Yi, who was holding the saber with both hands but bleeding between his thumb and index finger, suddenly roared. The muscles all over his body bulged, and the white robe all over his body exploded in an instant. The long saber chopped down. In an instant, all the lightning completely condensed on the blade. The long saber, which seemed to be able to cut the air into two halves, emitted dark green saber energy and completely suppressed the lightning on the blade. There seemed to be only dark green left in the whole world. A strike with all his strength. Mountain collapsing and ground cracking. Broken blade. Bai Yi's pupils had already condensed into one point. At this moment he also completely gave up all defense, and attacking and killing became his most instinctive desire. The dark green saber energy suppressed the lightning, bursting out from all over his body. All the strength was concentrated in his arms as he sprinted forward with small steps. Even if the saber broke, even if he died. At all costs. At this moment, Bai Yi's strength was still infinitely close to the half-step invincible realm, but the power of this strike had firmly reached the half-step invincible realm. The blade that was raised above his head had already fallen down, and there seemed to be thousands of sabers chopping down in the air at the same time. In his perception, apart from the blade, there seemed to be only death. The dark green saber energy whistled wildly, covering the battlefield between Bai Yi and Dawn. The saber energy kept gathering and flying in all directions. The two figures were completely shrouded in the saber energy, completely blurring for a moment. Boom. The surging, almost crazy saber energy finally broke out completely. The ground dozens of meters nearby suddenly sank down, and the roots of some trees deeply buried in the ground were shaken into the air. The saber energy was violently twisted. In the blurred scene, Bai Ye's unwilling and furious roar was so high and so weak. A white figure flew up into the air with a lot of blood. The drops of blood fell with the rain, which was shocking. On the battlefield where the ground had sunk for nearly half a meter, Don stood where he was, putting his palms together. A broken saber was tightly clamped between his palms. His expression was indifferent, and he let the blood flow between his hands without saying a word. Bai Ye's body was still rising in the air. He held the half of the long saber in his hand tightly, staring at Don on the ground with mixed feelings. At this moment he finally understood why this master with amazing strength whom he had never heard of didn't use a unique technique. He didn't have a unique technique. In other words, every move and every attack of his was a unique technique. Almost at the same time. When Bai Ye's body flew to the highest place, an old and weak but extremely powerful roar suddenly sounded. On the battlefield that seemed to be independent but connected with each other, a man in a scarlet-red robe suddenly jumped up from the ground and rushed to the other direction. The dim blue lightning rose up, and for a moment the dark forest was as bright as day. Tianyu, the high priest of Iasi Grand Shrine. Tianyu, who was defeated by Dawn in a very short time. And the direction he was rushing to, a horsewoman, who had been watching the battlefield closely, suddenly changed her face. That was the direction of Li Tianlan. The sword intent of the eighth blade fell, and there was lightning rising in the fire that hadn't dissipated yet. Prince Renwu's figure got close to Li Tianlan silently. The long saber swept across. And Tianyu's figure was still sprinting at a high speed. In an instant he was less than 10 meters away from Li Tianlan. In the fierce battle, everyone didn't forget what their target was. For East Island, Li Tianlan was their target, the most important target, no one else. Tianyu, how dare you? Don, who still put his palms together, looked pale, but his expression instantly turned furious. Swish. Almost no one could see his movement clearly. Don, who was dressed in white, suddenly rose up into the sky. In the blink of an eye, his figure had already jumped up into the sky and became a small white dot. Tianyu's figure was about to get close to Li Tianlan. Less than 5 meters. Horsewoman started sprinting without hesitation. Boom. In the highest place of the firmament, there was a faint loud noise like thunder. The wind and clouds changed. The gloomy sky seemed to start spinning in a trance. The white figure who rose up into the sky fell rapidly from the high sky, with pale lightning and endless killing intent. Above the ninth heaven the thunder was about to strike, and the thunder was rolling as if the sky was angry. A majestic and cold voice came from the high sky, with extreme anger. The cage of heaven and earth. Swish. Endless lightning fell directly from the high sky to the ground like a falling river and sea, running between the sky and the earth. Tianyu was less than 3 meters away from Li Tianlan. But the distance of 3 meters was like a mote. His body suddenly froze on the spot. In the endless lightning, he struggled to raise his hand, bit by bit, as if in slow motion. This was the domain. The domain that belonged to the invincible realm. Although it was not perfect, it was really close to the invincible realm. Maybe it was only a paper-thin distance. Dawn's body fell from the sky with endless lightning. Like a god. Ah! Tianyu suddenly screamed. In the cage made of lightning, his body suddenly expanded and a large amount of blood mist burst out. Inside the cage there was a world of lightning. Bang! The lightning lasted for a second and then suddenly exploded. The cage of heaven and earth collapsed. Tianyu, whose aura instantly fell from the half-step invincible realm to the ordinary thunder-shocking realm and was still falling, fled the battlefield as fast as he could without looking back. In the depths of the forest hundreds of meters away, the magnificent sword intent was generated again and swept everything. Same was coming. The situation was over. Holy light gritted his teeth, looked at Duke in front of him unwillingly, turned around suddenly and disappeared quickly. Clang. The human emperor collided with the long saber, and the huge power was transmitted to each other. Prince Renwu's body suddenly shook, and the dazzling lightning covered the saber. Prince Renwu pressed down with all his strength and suddenly released the power. Li Tianlan, who instinctively wanted to throw Prince Renwu away, burst out his power and instantly lifted Prince Renwu's body into the sky. When everyone retreated, the prince didn't have any city wall. The lightning flashed in the sky and his body disappeared again. Dark surprise attack. But this time he didn't use it for surprise attack. He used it directly to escape. The sword intent cut through the air, flashed in the forest and disappeared. Without any hesitation, Li Tianlan directly rushed up. He had the shadow formula, the desperate chase of Sai City, and the night walking of the Li family. In the battle in front of Li Tianlan, if he couldn't defeat him, he would die. Want to escape? What a joke. The sword light fell. Prince Renwu's figure appeared dozens of meters away. Almost at the same second, Li Tianlan had already switched places with his shadow and appeared next to Prince Renwu. Do you think you can escape? He sneered. The human emperor turned into a long spear again, stirred the fire, and directly smashed down. Prince Renwu also sneered. He was retreating. When Li Tianlan was about to continue to chase, a familiar and fatal danger instantly enveloped his whole body. This was an absolutely fatal danger. Li Tianlan's pupils instantly contracted. It's too late. At the same time, in the depths of the forest less than 300 meters away from Li Tianlan, a man wearing a top hat chuckled and put his finger directly on the trigger of the gun. The night rain drenched him from head to toe, and even the red scarf around his neck was wet and stuck to the ground. But his movements were still steady. He held the gun with both hands without any tremble. In his sight, Li Tianlan suddenly turned around. Bang! In the gunshot that almost shook the forest, a large wave of fire suddenly rushed out of the muzzle. The wave of fire condensed into a line in the air, and directly rushed to Li Tianlan. Heavenly Calamity. At the same time, Heavenly Calamity heard Li Tianlan's furious voice. 300 meters away, shooting at close range. Heavenly Calamity slightly raised the corner of his mouth with absolute confidence. The hot line of fire burned the forest, and a few East Island elites who didn't have time to retreat were directly smashed by the shot. I blossom in slaughter. Like a flower in the dawn. With a cruel look, Heavenly Calamity stared at Li Tianlan's position. In his sight, flesh and blood were exploding and flying. Only the line of fire was still stable, rushing to Li Tianlan. Heavenly Calamity squinted, turned the muzzle without hesitation, aimed at another angle, and directly pulled the trigger. Chapter 183. A peak assassination. From the initial observation of the target, sneaking in, setting up an ambush, hiding, waiting, looking for an opportunity, finding the shooting angle, planning the retreat route. This series of work often took a lot of time, and all of this was often for the moment of the assassination. In an instant, life and death were decided. For real superiors, life and death were often decided in less than a second. It was too late. When the blazing line of fire smashed the bodies of several East Island elites and rushed straight to Li Tianlan, when the line of fire was still running in the air, Heavenly Calamity already knew that his shot was too slow. This was the perfect angle, the perfect distance, the perfect timing, and the perfect trajectory. But the bullet mixed with the raging fire met an obstacle when it flew in the air. A very small and fragile obstacle. The bodies of several East Island elites were as fragile as glass under the bullet shot from the grim smile. But it was because of these East Island elites that the bullet directly rushed to Li Tianlan a little slower. How much slower? Half a second? 1/3 of a second? Or even less. But this extremely short time was enough for Li Tianlan to make the most instinctive reaction. The bright and blazing flame ran across the whole forest. In the flame, the bullet seemed to have completely disappeared, and only the deafening sound of the gunshot was still echoing. Switch positions. Li Tianlan's figure suddenly disappeared. At the same time, in the grass hundreds of meters away, Heavenly Calamity held the famous gun in his hand, grim smile, and directly changed his position. The gunshot was louder. In Li Tianlan's sight, the whole world was like a volcanic eruption, and all in front of him was erupting magma. Compared with the penetration of the last shot, this shot completely destroyed. The flame roared and rushed in the forest. Li Tianlan's body just changed positions with the shadow, and a large piece of flame had directly kicked in front of him. A silhouette suddenly appeared in front of him, completely blocking his body. The dignified and charming plump figure slightly bent her body, with her palms forward, and opened her hands in a fearless manner. A faint blue light curtain shone from all directions on the ground. The light curtain didn't spread but condensed. Boom! The moment the fire wave hit the light curtain, the whole light curtain had become a huge shield. Absolute protection. Knight of the 12 Supermasters of Samsara, a supermaster who was best at defense. Her unique technique was not outstanding in attack, but in terms of defense, there were not many people in the Thundershocking realm, including some half-step invincible realm experts, who could break her defense directly. The fire and the lightning collided, and the whole forest shook violently. Numerous cracks suddenly appeared on the shield, which had almost been condensed into a substance by the lightning. Raging flames spread from the cracks. Horsewoman's body shook violently, and a large mouthful of blood spurted from the corner of her mouth. But she did not care about her injury at all. She just stood in front of Li Tianlan, trembling all over but not taking a step back. Even if she had to die, she would die in front of him. Be careful. Horsewoman's tone was weak. For the first time since she met Li Tianlan, there was a hint of hopeless helplessness and panic on her face. Heavenly Calamity, the top killer in the dark world, held two famous guns in his hands, one whispering and the other grinning. Samsara's information on Calamity wasn't much, but it definitely wasn't little. Two famous guns made Heavenly Calamity, and Heavenly Calamity also made two famous guns. Whisper was a pistol with a fast shooting speed and a large magazine capacity. It was a self-defense weapon for close combat. It was also the gun that Heavenly Calamity used the least. Whisper was dusty because of the grinning. Grinning was a sniper rifle, and in terms of power, it was definitely one of the most powerful sniper rifles under the 12 murderous weapons. Most importantly, this gun could shoot continuously after temporary modification. 3 shots in a row. This was Heavenly Calamity's trump card. With his muzzle, after 3 shots in a row, there were very few targets who could stand in front of him, whether the target was in the thunder-shocking realm or the fire-flaming realm. This kind of temporary modification was said to seriously damage a certain part of Grinning's body. In short, it burned money, so Heavenly Calamity rarely used it. But now the second shot had broken Horsewoman's shield. Where was the third shot? Horsewoman's mind was blank. Who on earth wanted to kill Li Tianlan? All kinds of thoughts flashed crazily in her mind. Facing the coming third shot, she had no choice but to grit her teeth and fight to the death. The first shot and the second shot sounded almost at the same time. The loud gunshots echoed in the forest for a long time. Duke was already seriously injured and powerless. Don was still standing there, but no one knew what he was thinking, and his eyes became a little dazed. Hundreds of meters away, the enormous sword intent in the forest was approaching quickly. The third shot was about to rush out of the barrel. Horsewoman clenched her teeth, and her body shook violently. With a slight sound, a large amount of blood spurted from her body into the air like a fountain. The blood and the lightning intertwined and dripped on the shield that seemed to have been condensed into a substance by the lightning. The flames in the cracks were forcibly dispelled. At a glance, the lightning in front of Horsewoman had become extremely ghastly scarlet, indescribably tragic. Suddenly, Li Tianlan's eyes turned red. It's useless. In the grass hundreds of meters away, through the sniper scope, Heavenly Calamity stared at the intertwining red and blue lightning in front of him with cold eyes. A trace of a confident smile with an extremely bloody smell appeared at the corner of his mouth. Knowing your importance, how could I not make preparations? After a short but suffocating pause, Heavenly Calamity directly took out a scarlet bullet from his sleeve. The bullet was elegant and long, with sharp edges faintly visible. It was like a blood-stained scarlet color with a strong smell of death. The bullet was called God Destroyer. For many years, Heavenly Calamity had worked hard to get 3. This was a big gift, not only for Li Tianlan, but also for the superiors of the half-step invincible realm present. The bullet was pressed into the barrel. Holding a grim smile, Heavenly Calamity's smile was ferocious. In his sight, Horsewoman's blood seemed to dye every bolt of lightning red. Her body was shaking, and the shield in front of her became pure blood red. Interesting. He spoke softly, put his finger on the trigger, concentrated, and shot. Heavenly Calamity. All of a sudden, a roar came from behind the blood-red shield. It was an indescribable roar, with a rage that was completely beyond reason. Endless fierceness seemed to condense into one point in an instant. Li Tianlan's figure directly rushed out of the blood-red light curtain. As the lightning roared, the blood-red shield in front of Horsewoman was smashed, and countless beads of blood rolled back to Horsewoman's body. Li Tianlan brushed past Horsewoman and took her body to the side. In an instant. Through the sniper scope, Heavenly Calamity only saw a pair of blood-red eyes with extreme madness. Indifference, ghastly, and resentment. That was a pair of eyes without any human emotions, only negative emotions, scarlet and weird. Speed up. Run wildly. Sprint. Li Tianlan's figure rushed straight over, with complete rage and madness, like a completely enraged beast. All the matter in the world seemed to disappear in an instant. The lightning behind Li Tianlan had completely dissipated. There was no sword intent, no raging fire. There was only a kind of killing intent that was so strong that it made people unable to breathe between heaven and earth. There was no medium, only the most primitive, most naked, and most ferocious killing intent. Gotcha. 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 Strange noises kept ringing out. Heavenly Calamity suddenly came to his senses. In a trance, the extremely precious god of destruction in the gun had already been unconsciously shot out by him. This most precious trump card was not aimed, so the accuracy could be imagined. But Heavenly Calamity had no time to care about the pain. In his sight, Li Tianlan's figure rushed over at an incomprehensible speed. At the same angle in a completely straight line. There seemed to be no weapon in his hand. He was just a person. Indomitable and invincible. Several thick trees that needed several people to hug were in front of him, but he didn't change his direction at all. He just rushed over. The branches and leaves all over the sky shook wildly, and the thick trunks broke into countless sawdust. As the sawdust flew, Li Tianlan's speed was getting faster and faster. That furious roar seemed to have not dissipated, and Li Tianlan had already rushed over half the distance. At this moment, Heavenly Calamity's heart was cold. Fear, even panic, instantly occupied his mind. He held the grim smile in his hand tightly and kept pulling the trigger, but his whole body didn't dare to move. He had never seen a charge in such a situation, and he had never felt such a fierce sense of oppression. Li Tianlan was getting closer and closer, and everything in front of him was smashed into pieces. His reason kept reminding Heavenly Calamity that the person in front of him was just a fire-flaming realm young man, and his real realm was only in the ice-condensing realm. But the figure that was crazily approaching in his sight was like a demon in his perception. The sword light in front of him scattered. In a very short time, Prince Renwu, who was also desperately running, finally got close to Heavenly Calamity. He didn't even have time to breathe but pulled Heavenly Calamity up and shouted in a low voice, "Go!" Heavenly Calamity seemed to wake up from a dream, and he suddenly got up from the ground. But he felt his limbs were so weak that he almost fell down again. That extremely crazy killing intent seemed to be getting closer and closer. He shook his head fiercely, put the grim smile on his back and said in a deep voice, "Go!" Shadow Formula. Desperate Chase. Dark Night Walking. His speed was getting faster and faster, and everything in his sight became blurred. The road ahead was moving backward quickly, and the rain and the strong wind fell on his face and body, making him feel pain all over his body. The pain came from inside to outside. The strong wind was howling around his ears. But Li Tianlan could still clearly feel that the bones in his body were making sounds as if they couldn't bear the heavy load. He used all the unique skills that could speed up. Li Tianlan almost didn't care about anything. He shortened the distance between them. His realm was rising crazily from the fire-flaming realm to the stabilization phase of the fire-flaming realm, to the peak phase and still rising. His will, which was as firm as iron, was burning crazily. Vaguely, Li Tianlan seemed to feel that he had become an extremely fierce momentum. Everything in the world, including everything in front of him, was smashed into pieces. His momentum kept rising crazily, and his killing intent became more and more turbulent, going straight up to the sky. In the twinkling of an eye, Li Tianlan's soaring momentum suddenly fell straight down, but his killing intent was still rising. His realm, which had reached the critical point of the thunder-shocking realm, declined rapidly, falling from the peak of the fire-flaming realm to the initial fire-flaming realm in the blink of an eye. The bottle of surge potion from North America seemed to have lost its effect. His realm fell from the fire-flaming realm to the ice-condensing realm in a flash, and then continued to fall directly into the chi-controlling realm. Li Tianlan didn't know it. But his falling realm was stabilized at the level of the fulfillment of the chi-controlling realm, and then continued to rise at an almost violent speed. He entered the ice-condensing realm. After the stabilization phase of the ice-condensing realm stabilized a little, almost in an instant he returned to the state close to the thunder-shocking realm. He broke through. Li Tianlan finally came to his senses. The darkness in front of him seemed to become clearer, and the pain in his body was greatly reduced. Vaguely, his third shadow seemed to have a closer connection with him. The path after the fulfillment of the chi-controlling realm went further. At the same time, the ice-condensing realm also officially entered the stabilization phase. Li Tianlan slowed down a little, but his speed increased in an instant. He was happy that there was no breakthrough. The rage in his heart, which seemed to want to kill everything, became clearer. The rage came from Horsewoman. There was no friendship between him and Horsewoman. Horsewoman risked her life to protect him only because of Qin Weibai's order. But it didn't matter to Li Tianlan. At that moment, when the blood-colored shield took shape, he could clearly feel Horsewoman's determination to die. He didn't want to owe this kind of life-risking kindness because he already owed a lot of people and he couldn't afford to pay them back. The rage also came from his pride. He had the strongest physique, the most powerful inheritance, and the most outstanding environment. He was the heavenly son of the world, not king wretch who needed others to stand in his way. Heavenly Calamity had attacked him once and now he dared to attack him again? Heavenly Calamity. You want to kill me? Who do you think you are? The extreme rage made Li Tianlan's eyes completely red. He had completely lost his reason and all that was left in his mind was killing. Prince Renwu was running wildly. Heavenly Calamity was also running wildly. But the distance between them was instantly shortened. 50 meters. 30 meters. 20 meters. Li Tianlan suddenly let out a long roar. His body leaped into the air, and he threw himself at the back of Heavenly Calamity who looked extremely thin. Your Highness, take care. On the ground, Heavenly Calamity felt the absolutely fatal danger, so he gritted his teeth and said that. Li Tianlan was getting closer and closer. Heavenly Calamity casually took out a grenade-like thing and threw it into the air. At the same time, his body directly accelerated, and he instantly surpassed Prince Renwu. As a superior of the thunder-shocking realm who had killed many people of the fire-flaming realm when he was only in the fire-flaming realm, how could he only have a whisper to protect himself when he was approached? This grenade wasn't very lethal, but it was also a powerful weapon that could help him get out of danger. As for Prince Renwu, he wasn't Heavenly Calamity's employer on this trip to East Island, or even the whole East Island. The reason why they cooperated tonight was because they helped him get out of the chase once. Now that they had done that, Heavenly Calamity didn't care about the ending. Another 500 meters ahead. He would be absolutely safe. Heavenly Calamity, you. Prince Renwu's expression changed dramatically. That grenade flew into the air and a silver light flashed in the air. The human emperor turned into a long spear and directly blew up the grenade. In an instant, countless shrapnel flew up along with a large amount of fire, and an extremely condensed impact instantly hit the space within a dozen meters nearby. The air was violently twisted, and the airflow was turbulent. Li Tianlan suddenly slowed down like he was suddenly hit by a strong wind. In the storm, Prince Renwu staggered, and his eyes were gloomy and ferocious. He was very clear that Heavenly Calamity was Li Tianlan's target, and so was he. Now Tianyu escaped with serious injuries, Holy Light left, and Bai Yi also escaped. He was the only one left. But he was behind Tianyu. How could he die? Prince Renwu's expression became more and more ferocious and twisted. He was a nephew who was highly valued by the Mikado. Among the princes in Country R, his position was only second to the crown prince. After Night Spirit was destroyed, East Island wanted to use the Shinto power and the remaining foundation of Night Spirit to support a new superpower to replace Night Spirit's position. Prince Renwu, who was extremely talented in martial arts, became the most obvious candidate. He still had a very exciting future, so how could he die here? At this moment, the prince's heart was filled with ferociousness, but there was only regret in his heart. If he didn't chase after Dongqing Rushi? If he didn't want the border Praetorian Corps of Zhongzhou State to become his bargaining chip? If he didn't plan to capture Li Tianlan alive? There were too many ifs. How good would it be if none of them happened? In the great regret, Prince Renwu suddenly shook the long knife in his hand. The knife light surged up, and there was a patch of dark green in the twisted airflow. Prince Renwu managed to stabilize his body, then he raised the knife and moved forward. The mountain fell and the ground cracked. The lightning and the dark green knife light intertwined and chopped at Li Tianlan. Vaguely, the silver long spear in his sight turned into two swords. The sword light flashed. Prince Renwu seemed to hear the sound of the joints in Li Tianlan's body exploding, and there seemed to be a surging power pouring out of his body like a river. Prince Renwu still didn't feel the sword intent, and there seemed to be a sharp sword light in the light. There was no sword intent and the world was filled with killing intent. Jian Shirsi, slaughter. The bright sword light instantly chopped the chaotic airflow caused by the explosion of the grenade. Li Tianlan didn't even look at Prince Renwu. He rushed past him and went straight to Heavenly Calamity. The sword light forcibly chopped countless airflows and lightning. The long knife in Prince Renwu's hand was broken, and the green light scattered. In front of him, the whole world was broken into pieces. Countless blood lines spurted out from his body. With a muffled sound, his arms, legs and head were all separated from his body. The sword intent exploded in his body, and the body of the Prince of East Island, who was trying to change a princess a few minutes ago and was supposed to have a bright future, was directly torn into pieces. Help me. Seeing that the grenade didn't work, Heavenly Calamity finally couldn't suppress the fear in his heart anymore, and he suddenly shouted at the front. There were still 300 meters. At this distance, Li Tianlan could save him. The forest in front of him was dark and silent. Li Tianlan's figure behind him came quickly, and he was getting closer and closer. Heavenly Calamity clenched his teeth and turned around directly. A large amount of blazing fire rose up around him, and there was lightning in the fire. Heavenly Calamity had a grim smile on his back, and in his hand, he had already taken out a very simple short gun, but the muzzle was very deep. The short gun was a little longer than a normal pistol, and its caliber was also a little bigger. It was completely gray and didn't look very eye-catching. But this gun was one of the most famous pistols in the whole dark world. Famous gun whisper. Li Tianlan's figure swooped down. Facing Li Tianlan, Heavenly Calamity's figure moved back quickly, and at the same time he held whisper and fired quickly. Bang bang bang. Dense gunshots exploded in the forest, and countless bullets flew towards Li Tianlan in the air. Li Tianlan's figure seemed to have disappeared completely. Behind Heavenly Calamity, there was only a ball of fire that was burning at its limit. Heavenly Calamity shot crazily and his face was grim. In his sight, the fiercely burning flames suddenly exploded, and countless sparks flew out, covering all the area within dozens of meters. There was even ice in the sparks. Ice and fire were flying, and Li Tianlan's figure kept flashing in the spreading ice and fire, as if he was everywhere. In the blink of an eye, he had shortened the distance again with the flying ice and fire, and rushed directly to Heavenly Calamity. Bang bang bang. Completely out of instinct, Heavenly Calamity shot regardless of the consequences. The bullets rushed to Li Tianlan, and Li Tianlan also rushed to him. 2 bullets pierced through Li Tianlan's abdomen and shoulders and blood splattered. Li Tianlan's expression was cold, and he approached Heavenly Calamity instantly. The human emperor changed from a sword to a dagger, and the human emperor stabbed the upper part of Heavenly Calamity's hand. A large amount of blood suddenly rose with Heavenly Calamity's scream. Crazy. This guy was crazy. Heavenly Calamity's heart was filled with unprecedented fear. The whisper in his hand kept shooting bullets, but Li Tianlan didn't dodge and almost rushed straight to the bullets. He waved his saber. One after another, deep saber wounds appeared on Heavenly Calamity's body, and blood flew unscrupulously in the darkness. There was Li Tianlan's blood, and there was Heavenly Calamity's blood. Li Tianlan's face was pale, but his eyes were like those of a wild beast, and it seemed that he was going to tear Heavenly Calamity apart. Heavenly Calamity had to die. He had to die. Repeating this thought over and over like hypnosis, Li Tianlan's actions became crazier and crazier. Swish. Heavenly Calamity, who finally saw what a lunatic was, seemed to be completely desperate. Suddenly he threw the whisper in his hand and like throwing a stone, the whisper hit Li Tianlan's head hard. Blood splattered. Li Tianlan looked at Heavenly Calamity, who had thrown away the gun in his hand, and subconsciously froze for a moment. In this extremely rare gap, Heavenly Calamity, who was covered in blood and whose upper body was almost torn apart by the human emperor, suddenly jumped up and kicked Li Tianlan's chest hard. An explosive sound suddenly burst out from his body, and his whole body, like a meteor, rushed to the forest in front of him at an extreme speed. Li Tianlan chased after him without hesitation. A dark figure suddenly appeared next to Li Tianlan and pressed his shoulder. A low and deep voice sounded beside his ear, solemn and dignified. Don't move, it's dangerous. Li Tianlan's eyes flashed with scarlet and bloodthirsty light, and he stared coldly at the dark figure in front of him. I'm Saint. The dark figure said in a calm and brief tone. His whole body was covered in a black cloak, and he carried an ordinary-looking long sword on his back, looking extremely mysterious. Horsewoman is fine. Everyone is fine. Today's fight is just to save people. That's enough. Saint stood in front of Li Tianlan motionlessly, looking at the forest in front of him and said in a calm tone. Enough? Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows, and there was undisguised coldness in his tone. Even if it's not enough, Saint's voice was hoarse and he said softly, it's not suitable to continue the chase today. Through the black cloak, his eyes were fixed on the forest in front of him. It was silent in front of the forest. But intuitively, Li Tianlan could sense that Heavenly Calamity didn't seem to run away immediately. Who's over there? Saint suddenly asked. His voice was hoarse and calm, and it echoed in the forest hundreds of meters away. There seemed to be a large amount of sword intent in the air, rising and falling like tides. It was quiet in the forest. After a short silence, Saint continued, Which murderous weapon is it? Murderous weapon. Li Tianlan was suddenly shocked, and the red light in his eyes faded away. He woke up from the state of slaughter, and his perception suddenly became sharp. At this moment, Li Tianlan stared at the forest in front of him, and all his hair stood on end. Just in front of him, there seemed to be an extremely huge and dangerous aura in the dark trees. It seemed to be motionless, but in a trance, it seemed to devour the world. That huge sense of oppression was looming, but it was with fatal ferocity and violence. In that majestic momentum, Li Tianlan suddenly felt his own insignificance and powerlessness. Murderous weapon. One of the 12 murderous weapons in the dark world. Chapter 184. A chapter of more than 5,000 words. The murderous weapon didn't move. Saint didn't move either. The desolate atmosphere filled the world, and the atmosphere was so oppressive that it almost solidified. Li Tianlan's boiling blood gradually calmed down and then became cold. It was piercingly cold. He was in a trance in the dark rain. Relying on his intuition, Li Tianlan could almost clearly feel the muzzle of the murderous weapon pointing at him from a distance. A huge sense of oppression and crisis completely enveloped him, as if he would turn into wisps of dust after a loud noise. Confrontation. It was quiet in the mountain forest. Li Tianlan's pupils had been extremely condensed, and the sharpness in his eyes had completely disappeared. His eyes were full of thick darkness and deathly stillness. The world was full of killing intent. The killing intent was invisible and intangible, but it tore his clothes silently. One after another, bloody wounds appeared all over his body. The wounds were very thin and shallow, but the blood kept flowing. Li Tianlan clenched the human emperor in his hand and suddenly took a step forward. Saint's expression hidden behind the cloak changed dramatically, and he straightened his body almost instantly. Li Tianlan's face was expressionless, and his pupils were dark and gloomy. The killing intent driven by the murderous weapon in the forest was turbulent fiercely as he moved forward. The pressure was like a mountain, and the naked and cruel evil spirit turned into real killing intent, wrapping Li Tianlan layer by layer. Li Tianlan continued to move forward. The second step. His entire body was already covered in blood, yet his body still stood ramrod straight as he passed through the layer upon layer of killing intent emitted by the murderous weapon. An extremely fierce battle will seem to have risen from the ground and shot straight into the curtain of rain above. In this life I can't be defeated and I can't retreat. If I fail I will die. There is no way back. Saint's eyes were slightly relaxed. In his perception, in the mountain forest hundreds of meters ahead, the intense danger that even he could clearly feel seemed to be quietly retreating. It retreated but did not disperse. The mountain forest in front of him seemed to be full of fierce killing intent, which was integrated with heaven and earth, like the rising sun and the setting moon, irresistible. The killing intent in the air gradually receded. The danger gradually receded. Saint grabbed Li Tianlan's shoulder and retreated to the battlefield at the back with him. The battlefield was a mess. This chaotic battle that had only lasted for a few minutes was extremely tragic. Those who survived naturally did not have it easy. As for the dead, not to mention a complete corpse, not even the most fragmented parts were left. The knight and the duke were leaning against each other. Both of them looked abnormally dispirited. Both of them had pale faces and were covered in blood. Their auras were also declining. There was no doubt that the knight was wronged. Heavenly Calamity was known as the contemporary gun king, and the power of Grimm's smile was amazing enough. But it was not so easy for him to kill a top thunder-shocking realm master like Knight. If Knight got close, Heavenly Calamity could not even hold on for half a minute under Knight's attack. Even if Knight could not break through the blockade of Heavenly Calamity's firepower, it was not easy for Grimm's smile to hit Knight. But tonight, Knight stood straight and took the second shot of Grimm's smile without dodging. Now he was only seriously injured, but he still had some strength left, which showed that the guardian of the supermaster of samsara deserved his reputation. Dongqing Rushi had already woken up, as if she had just woken up from a dream. Her clear eyes were full of confusion, and she looked a little confused. Seeing Li Tianlan and Saint walking back together, her eyes slightly brightened. She struggled to get up and walk to him, but then she seemed to think of something. She waved her two tender white hands, and the night rain suddenly condensed into blue frost, and then turned into a cloud of semi-liquid water vapor. She forcefully wiped her dirty little face, but after so many days of fleeing, her face was dirty, so how could her palms be clean? As a result, she made use of the water vapor to smear her face more and more dirty. Unknowingly, she had smeared her dusty but still recognizable face into that of a real tabby cat. Even Li Tianlan, who was full of hostility, did not know whether to laugh or cry when he saw this scene. Saint's body slightly trembled in the black robe. As for Knight and Duke, they did not even look at her, as if they were afraid that laughing would affect their internal injuries. Dongqing Rushi also seemed to find something strange. She looked at her hands subconsciously, but she did not scream or get angry. She just stood there quietly looking a little silly. Don't wipe it. Go back and do it slowly. Li Tianlan walked over and said softly. He looked at the people beside Dongqing Rushi who were still in a coma and shook his head. Coma was the most instinctive self-protection mechanism of the human body, which was good for their recovery. I'm very beautiful. Dongqing Rushi looked at Li Tianlan with her clear eyes that were as bright as stars and said in a serious tone. I can see that. Li Tianlan nodded. Facing Dongqing Rushi, it seemed that he had a headache and was a little embarrassed in any situation. I told Grandpa that I would marry you after I graduated. Last time you went to my house, I ran away. Are you angry? Dongqing Rushi could look straight into Li Tianlan's eyes at first, but in the end she subconsciously lowered her head. Suddenly, Li Tianlan's blood appeared in her sight. The gunshot wounds and knife wounds were exposed to the air through the torn clothes. Although Saint had helped to take out the bullets and put medicine on them, the 4 or 5 bullet holes still looked very shocking. Dongqing Rushi raised her head again and looked at Li Tianlan with burning eyes. Her voice was a little cold, but with a trace of natural and clear childish voice. It sounded very soft. Are these wounds for me? No. Li Tianlan's heart sank for no reason. Feeling the vague eyes of the 3 supermasters of samsara around him, he felt a pain in the ass. He directly pointed at Li Baidian and the others on the ground. These are all my brothers, so, that's why. Under the bright eyes, Li Tianlan broke out in a cold sweat for no reason. It seemed that his injuries were relapsing, and it was difficult for him to speak. You're still angry. Dongqing Rushi looked at Li Tianlan quietly. Even her tone was quiet, and there was no trace of grievance in her voice. Li Tianlan wanted to deny it, but he felt that this feeling was really weird. He said helplessly, It doesn't matter at all. The most important thing is whether you like me or not, and whether you want to marry me, isn't it? I do. Dongqing Rushi's tone was soft as if she was being hypnotized. Li Tianlan asked her if she wanted to marry him, but she said she did. What Li Tianlan wanted was an answer, but what Dongqing Rushi gave him was an inevitable result. Did it matter? It didn't seem to matter. Grandpa said that I can only marry you. It was still that kind of quiet tone. It was not a kind of despair but a kind of calmness with a heart like a starry sky. She said softly, Grandpa said that I can only marry you. Li Tianlan couldn't understand how much pressure, seriousness, and desire were contained in this sentence. He only felt a little headache, but he couldn't hide his pride. Of course he would never admit it. But perhaps every man would understand the kind of secret pleasure in his heart. Let's go back first. Saint suddenly said, This is not a place to stay for a long time. The first supermaster of samsara rarely spoke, but once he did, Li Tianlan felt that he was very natural and confident. Duke didn't know him for a long time, but when they occasionally chatted, Li Tianlan enjoyed some flattery from the 4th supermaster of samsara. Duke was naturally an expert, but in Li Tianlan's heart, his moral integrity had long fallen to the ground, and he didn't have any demeanor of a supermaster at all. Horsewoman was relatively soft and docile, and she just carried out Qin Weibai's orders. Flaming Fire's hostility to him was almost undisguised, or maybe she couldn't hide it, but she couldn't touch him. Li Tianlan felt conflicted for her. Only Saint was calm, mysterious and indifferent. He was not cold, but his aura was extremely high. Only in him, Li Tianlan felt a little bit of the temperament of the supermaster of samsara. Li Tianlan nodded. Each of them took one person and carried the unconscious people on their backs. Through the forest. On the way back. About 5 kilometers away from the forest, an inconspicuous appearance of a bus had already stopped there. Under the dim night sky, the bus was like a well-disguised big bread. The tiny but conspicuous headlights shone on the winding road in front of them. The rain was drawn along the light into obvious silk lines. Saint walked in the front. Without greeting the driver, he carried Su Chu, who was the heaviest on his back, directly into the bus. The inside of the bus was not much different from the ordinary bus, but the distance between the seats was so wide that it made people feel relaxed and happy. The seats were all made of leather, which was soft and comfortable. Saint threw the behemoth Su Chu on the sofa, found a seat at random and calmly ordered, "Start the bus." The engine of the bus made a very surging roar, and the bus slowly started. Li Tianlan put down Li Baidian on his back and then sat beside him, panting. The medicinal powder that Saint applied to him on the way was very effective. When the medicine entered his body, he felt a sense of coolness all over his body, and even his spirit seemed to recover a lot. But this kind of medicine took effect quickly, and the time it lasted was also very short. After carrying Li Baidian for several kilometers, Li Tianlan barely made it to the bus. He was dizzy and his body seemed to be empty. The feeling of weakness kept hitting his body, as if it was going to pull his consciousness into the darkness. Li Tianlan gritted his teeth and suddenly asked, "Which murderous weapon is it?" Murderous weapon. Before Saint opened his mouth, Duke beside him was suddenly shocked. He looked at Li Tianlan and then at Duke, and his expression suddenly became serious. "You were chasing Heavenly Calamity, and you encountered a murderous weapon? Is it in Heavenly Calamity's hands?" "No." Saint was silent for a while and then shook his head and said, "No force dares to lend a murderous weapon to Heavenly Calamity, and he is only in the fire-flaming realm. How useful can a murderous weapon be if it is given to him? The person with the murderous weapon is hiding in the darkness and he didn't shoot, so we can't tell which murderous weapon it is." Li Tianlan panted, subconsciously touched his pocket, and took out a pack of cigarettes. But he didn't hold it firmly and it fell directly under the sofa. Dongqing Rushi, who was sitting beside him, bent down to pick it up and lit it for him without saying a word. Li Tianlan took a big drag on the cigarette, trying to cheer up his consciousness, which seemed to be about to pass out at any time. Of all the people present, it seemed that no one noticed that when he was chasing Heavenly Calamity, there was one less person on the original battlefield. Maybe someone noticed it, but they never suspected it. When did Dawn leave? Li Tianlan suddenly asked, and there was a kind of well-concealed coldness in his tone. Saint was slightly stunned, glanced at Li Tianlan, and then narrowed his eyes, looking at Duke and Horsewoman. "Tianlan, you suspect it was Dawn? There's no reason." Paladin said subconsciously. "I just want to ask when he left." Li Tianlan said calmly. Dawn and Daybreak basically belonged to the same force, but he didn't know what this force was called, or what kind of cooperation this force had with Samsara. According to Duke, this matter seemed to involve the top secret of Samsara, and at present, only the master of Samsara Palace and Qin Weibai knew everything. Everything was unknown, so naturally there was no way to infer. But any seemingly flawless kindness, on the contrary, was most likely to become the most fatal danger, and he still understood this truth. This was also an important reason why Li Tianlan had not even let down his vigilance against the Dongqing clan until now. What kind of cooperation did the force behind Dawn and Daybreak have with Samsara? In such a cooperation, would his death lead to some other results of this cooperation? Li Tianlan was not sure about this, but he could be sure that there was still such a possibility. The dark world was full of black and blood. How could good and evil be clearly seen under the intertwining of these two colors? Horsewoman thought for a moment, and her face suddenly became a little ugly. "He almost disappeared when you went after Heavenly Calamity. But there's still one thing that can't be explained." Saint suddenly said, "The mysterious force behind them should not have a murderous weapon." Should? Li Tianlan took a drag of the cigarette and asked. "Now 11 of the 12 murderous weapons in the Dark World have clear owners. They either belong to the superpowers in the Dark World or some world-class powers, and the missing one has not appeared for many years. The only thing we can be sure of is that the murderous weapon is not damaged, but it is missing. In terms of time, the missing time of the murderous weapon is even earlier than the time when the Li family's infinite sky was destroyed." Duke explained softly, "And the mysterious force we are cooperating with this time is just a dark force that has risen in recent years. Many of their foundations are not even perfect, so it has nothing to do with the missing murderous weapon. And the time doesn't match." Li Tianlan took a drag of the cigarette and tried to blink his eyes to prevent himself from passing out. He said calmly, "Is there no murderous weapon in East Island?" The three super masters of Samsara looked at each other and seemed a little strange. "East Island? There used to be. In the organization of Night Spirit." Duke smiled and said in a playful tone. Li Tianlan suddenly understood. The murderous weapon Blue Sky Underworld. This was the murderous weapon that used to belong to Night Spirit, and it could also be said to belong to East Island. But with the destruction of Night Spirit, this killing weapon, which ranked very high among the 12 murderous weapons, was now in the hands of the master of Samsara Palace. East Island had no murderous weapon now. Even if East Island could borrow a murderous weapon, it would not give it to Dawn. And this murderous weapon tonight has nothing to do with East Island. Otherwise, the other side would not have retreated tonight, and it would have been better to shoot directly. Obviously, they don't want to attract East Island's attention. At least, they don't want East Island to know that there is a murderous weapon that can threaten the superiors of the invincible realm in their territory. Saint narrowed his eyes and he looked more and more profound. The person behind this has a big plan. Li Tianlan's eyelids became heavier and heavier. In a trance, he seemed to remember the night when he first met Daybreak. That night, Daybreak once said that the barrel of Grimm's Smile, the famous gun in Heavenly Calamity's hand, was given to Heavenly Calamity many years ago. This was a superpower that was really hiding in the dark. What was the real face behind the darkness? Li Tianlan wanted to say something, but his consciousness became more and more dizzy. Darkness came to his eyes and he passed out completely. There was silence in the bus. Dongqing Rushi sat beside Li Tianlan, staring at his face blankly. The light in her beautiful big eyes became dimmer and dimmer. She tried to blink a few times, but she refused to open her eyes again. The bus passed through the night rain, running on the mountain road at a high speed. The raindrops pattered on the window, and the atmosphere in the whole bus became a little weird. The bus went straight down. As far as the eye could see, in the distance in the rain, there seemed to be lights faintly. Duke finally spoke. He looked at Horsewoman seriously and said calmly, "Should we tell the palace master about what Tianlan said?" The dark cloak covered Saint's face and his expression couldn't be seen, but his tone was still calm. "Don't worry. I will contact them again in the near future. Let's talk about it then." "I don't think so. What happened tonight was too dangerous. If you hadn't arrived in time..." Duke thought of the sword that instantly shattered Rattlesnake's body hundreds of meters away, and then he thought of Heavenly Calamity's shot. He shook his head. "In fact, you were still late. There is no if." Saint suddenly shook his head. "Even if I didn't show up, nothing would have happened." He turned his head and seemed to look at Duke through the cloak. He said in a low voice, "Have you forgotten Dongqing Rushi's sword?" Duke's expression froze, and the sword intent of myriad paths peerless appeared in his mind. He opened his mouth and said subconsciously, "How did you do that?" Saint was a little confused. "I mean, how did you turn that sword into another sword?" Duke was smiling, but his smile was very forced. Saint was silent for a full 5 minutes and then he said slowly, "That sword strike was the real invincible sword intent, which was equivalent to the full attack of an invincible realm expert. It was the remaining sword intent in the silent sword, and Dongqing Rushi could trigger it at the cost of her life in that sword. Do you think I could suppress such a sword strike? And even turn it into another sword?" Duke forced a smile as if he was suppressing the fear in his heart. "So you didn't do it?" Saint's body stiffened. After a long time he said blandly, "Of course it wasn't me. If it wasn't Saint, who else could it be?" Duke didn't dare to think about it for a moment. If it wasn't Saint, it meant that just now, under everyone's eyes, there was a super expert who made a move? He was able to suppress Dongqing Rushi's invincible sword and hide it from everyone's eyes. There was no doubt that he was also a real invincible realm expert. Why did such a person save Dongqing Rushi? Did an invincible realm expert make a move just to save people? Duke tried to make himself believe in this kind reason, but he felt more and more uneasy. It was obviously a good result, but all he could feel was malice. "Now East Island," Saint hesitated and said blandly, "the situation is out of everyone's control. Anyway, be careful from now on." He glanced at Li Tianlan, who was in a coma, and continued, "Anyway, protect this guy. If something happens to him, the boss will go crazy." "I'll try my best." Duke smiled, but his smile looked worse than crying. Saint didn't say anything. He just quietly turned his head and looked out of the window. Through the cloak and the blurry window, the rain and lights outside the car were mixed together, hazy and blurry. The night was thick. The road ahead was bleak and blurry. Only the rain flew tirelessly and messily, sprinkling all over the city. Chapter 185. When he opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was the warm and bright sunshine outside the window. The general trend was surging. It was raining and raining in East Island. The soft light passed through the dense treetops in the yard and through the window, forming a few lines of light with dust on the floor. The quietness seemed to spread all over the world. Time flowed gently in the space, with a kind of indifferent elegance. Li Tianlan was in a trance. For a moment he even felt that he was hallucinating. Before he closed his eyes, it was still dark and rainy in Zhongjing, and the neon lights were hidden in the extreme distance. It was just a moment when he closed his eyes. Where was this place? His thoughts were a little messy. He forced himself to sit up from the soft bed, which inadvertently affected the wounds on his body. The pain spread all over his body with weakness, which instantly woke him up. In the battle in the forest in Zhongjing, the superficial sword wounds were actually flesh wounds. The gunshot wounds he got in the process of chasing Heavenly Calamity were the most serious ones. 2 shots hit his abdomen and 1 went through his shoulder. Fortunately, the pistol named Whisper wasn't very powerful. It just had a fast shooting speed and a strong penetrating power. If it didn't hit the vital parts, it wouldn't be fatal. Otherwise, if the bullets of Whisper had half or even 1/3 of the power of Grim's Smile, he would have died without a whole body. Li Tianlan silently felt his state, looking calm. Although he didn't die in this battle, it wasn't optimistic either. The gunshot wounds caused a lot of bleeding, which almost triggered the previous injuries. The worst thing was that there would be a series of fierce battles, and they would be decisive battles. What he needed most was combat effectiveness. In his current state, it wasn't impossible for him to maintain his combat effectiveness, but he didn't want to pay the price. His arm was still in a drip, and the wound was still painful, but it wasn't heart-wrenching. It seemed that he had applied medicine again. Li Tianlan sighed. Now that he was completely awake, he knew that he was back to the small courtyard in Changdao with excellent environment and concealment. He was about to get out of bed to move his body. Just as he was about to get out of bed, the bedroom door was pushed open. Ning Qianqing, who was in combat uniform carrying a gun and a long sword, walked in. He was almost fully armed. Seeing Li Tianlan, who was about to get out of bed, he was slightly stunned and then surprised. "You're awake? Damn, you're finally awake." Li Tianlan didn't understand why he used the word finally. He asked in confusion, "Where are you going?" He paused and suddenly asked thoughtfully, "How long was I unconscious?" 3 days. Ning Qianqing quickly said, "Qingyan and I live next door to you. We wanted to see how you were before we set off." "How do you feel now? I'll call the doctor." Before Li Tianlan could speak, he took out his mobile phone and dialed a number. It seemed that he was calling Horsewoman. Li Tianlan didn't care about this. His face had become extremely ugly. 3 days. He was in a coma for 3 days? No wonder he felt unexpectedly good. After such a long time with all kinds of medicine, his injury had at least recovered a little with his physique. After all, he had drunk a whole set of immortality potions from the Wang family of Beihai. In terms of recovery ability, almost no one could match him. But even after 3 days of recovery, he was still extremely weak, which showed how serious his injury was before he fell into a coma. According to his own estimation, he was in a coma for 1 night at most. 3 days? In this sensitive period, too many things could happen in 72 hours. "How are they?" Li Tianlan lowered his voice and asked in a deep voice. His question was unclear, but Ning Qianqing immediately understood what he meant. He thought for a moment and tried his best to give a concise answer without losing the main point. "The current situation looks pretty good. I know some things. It seems that you had some Sari use their special channels? Some of our people who were scattered outside were picked up and brought back, about 700 people. Now they have safely arrived in Changdao. In addition, about 200 people died, and about 300 people are trapped outside Changdao." Li Tianlan listened quietly and didn't say a word. Ning Qianqing was talking about the people on the list. There were about 1,200 people. 700 people arrived in Changdao safely, 200 people died, and the remaining 300 people were still outside with the help. But what about the people who were not on the list? The Battle of Changdao was imminent, and the situation was extremely chaotic. It had reached, or even completely exceeded, the result that Zhongzhou State wanted. Whether it was Zhongzhou State, Changdao, or other dark forces in the dark world, they obviously didn't have the patience to prolong the chaos indefinitely. Obviously, at this time, they didn't have the patience to prolong the chaos indefinitely, especially Changdao. This was their home field, and the so-called final battle was naturally decided by them. In 3 days, it seemed that the Battle of Changdao, which was originally imminent, was suddenly brought closer to Li Tianlan. In addition to these people, there are less than 300 people who are also trying to break out. Some of them have already contacted us. Right now, everyone is close to Changdao. Everyone is ready for battle. We're not going anywhere, we're just waiting for orders. In recent days, East Island's defense line around Changdao has been broken through several times. They have suffered heavy losses, so they've stepped up their defense. Now we've contacted most of the people outside Changdao. We'll attack from both inside and outside at the most suitable time, and try to get as many people into Changdao as possible. Ning Qianxing walked over, took off the potion hanging above Li Tianlan's arm, and held it in his hand. He said with a smile, "Let's go. I'll go out with you to see the sunshine." Li Tianlan nodded and walked out of the room. He was still thinking about what Ning Qianxing said in his mind. Right now, there were at least 700 special warfare elites of Jianghu state in Changdao. If they counted carefully, the number might be close to 800. After all, a small number of people broke into Changdao before Samsara used special channels to receive them. Right now, there were about 600 people trapped outside. All in all, it was 1,400 at most. This also meant that nearly 1/3 of the 2,000 elites who entered East Island at the beginning had been lost. And with the final breakthrough, the number would definitely increase. East Island set up the defense line around Changdao not because they didn't want the elites of Jianghu state to enter Changdao. The purpose of the defense line was to make Jianghu state lose more blood. Now in the outside world, almost every elite of Jianghu state was followed by the elites of East Island. The pursuit had been going on for several days. From this point of view, the final breakthrough was almost as important as the Battle of Changdao that might break out at any time. The goal of Jianghu state was to let more people enter Changdao and gather their strength to deal with the final battle. And East Island hoped to reduce the number of elites of Jianghu state without paying a heavy loss. So they would chase behind and set up the defense line in Changdao, in order to attack from the front and the back and kill all the elites of Jianghu state as much as possible. If they could kill all of them, there would be no Battle of Changdao. Even if they couldn't kill all of them, as long as they killed most of them, the small number of Jianghu state people who entered Changdao was nothing to worry about. So this battle was bound to be extremely tragic. "Is there any information that we can use inside East Island?" Li Tianlan asked in a low voice. He was indeed very weak now, and he could almost feel the exhaustion when he moved. But in such a state, he should be able to maintain some combat effectiveness. And as time went by, his condition would get better and better. "No." Ning Qianxing shook his head. "Recently, it's hard for us to get any information from inside East Island. We have very little information about the defense line around Changdao." Just as he expected. As Li Tianlan expected, the last surprise attack around Changdao was the rehearsal of the final battle. East Island would definitely block the news as much as possible to prevent the information from being leaked as much as possible while investing more forces. From this point of view, people from Jianghu state were undoubtedly in a passive position. Because even if they wanted to rescue the elites outside Changdao, they lacked the information about the defense line around Changdao. How strong was the defense line that Changdao set up around Changdao? Did it have the hope of breaking through, or was it a complete steel plate? No one could say for sure. Judging from the fact that Ning Qianxing was fully armed and ready to fight at any time but didn't give any orders, it was obvious that the commander of the operation was also hesitating. Li Tianlan hesitated for a while and said nothing in the end. In fact, he knew that the intelligence network that Han Shixuan of Jianghu state had built in East Island over the years was uprooted, which was an important reason why it was hard for Jianghu state to receive relevant information from East Island. But Samsara was different. The mysterious force that cooperated with Samsara now had a much deeper foundation and covert level than the network set up by Han Shixuan. If this mysterious force took action, even if they couldn't get the core secrets of East Island, they could still get some not-so-secret secrets. At least Jianghu state wouldn't be at a loss like this. Obviously, this was a force that only cooperated with Samsara at the moment. Samsara cooperated with Jianghu state to plot against East Island. But what was the purpose of cooperating with this mysterious force? What was the purpose of this mysterious force? Vaguely, Li Tianlan seemed to have some feelings or intuition. Maybe it was what Samsara really needed. Or maybe it was this mysterious force hiding in the dark that Samsara really wanted to cooperate with. And their ultimate goal might be conflict with Jianghu state or even the opposite. Li Tianlan felt a little complicated. Yes, it was complicated. He still believed in Qin Weibai 100%, but when he thought of Samsara, he always felt a little weird. If everything proved to be true later. Was his silence today a form of treason in another sense? Treason? Humph, did he belong to Jianghu state? He kept hypnotizing himself, but Li Tianlan was getting more and more agitated. If he really thought about this question carefully, even he couldn't grasp his feelings. The general trend was unpredictable. People's hearts were unpredictable. His stance seemed even more unpredictable. The only thing that he firmly believed in was that he always believed that neither Samsara nor Qin Weibai would hurt him. But he and Jianghu state were two different things. Qin Weibai thought so. Even Li Tianlan himself vaguely seemed to think so. But why did he feel a little uncomfortable in his heart? Give me a cigarette. With Ning Qianqing's help, he walked into the yard. Bathed in the sun, Li Tianlan's pale face seemed to glow slightly. Ning Qianqing handed him a cigarette and lit it for him. Li Tianlan took a deep breath. After a long silence, he said softly, "Anyway, it's good to be alive." Ning Qianqing obviously didn't understand what he meant. He just thought he was talking about the battle in Zhongjing 3 days ago. He nodded with a smile and said, "Indeed, it's good to be alive. Fortunately, you guys arrived in time. I really thought I was going to die at that time, but when I woke up, I felt much better. Someone must have fed me medicine." Li Tianlan's heart skipped a beat. He vaguely felt that something was wrong, but he couldn't tell what was wrong. He shook his head and stopped thinking about it. He suddenly asked, "Is there any news about the second batch of elites entering East Island?" Ning Qianqing was obviously refreshed. He nodded, and his eyes gradually glowed with a hint of fanaticism. "There is news. General Gong Sun Chi of 9 Heavens will land in Jubin in 2 hours. Flaming Fire Supermaster has already left in the morning." Gong Sun Chi, Li Tianlan's eyes flickered and he said softly, "How many people are in the second batch?" "About 600. Ning Qianqing's face seemed a little unnatural. He said, "Because time is too tight, there is no time to lurk, so we can only pursue quality. Although the second batch is small, all of them are real elites. 600 Fire Flaming Realm experts. Zhongzhou State is really going all out this time." Li Tianlan's eyes were solemn and his face was expressionless. 600 Fire Flaming Realm experts. How many Fire Flaming Realm experts were there in the entire Zhongzhou State? The power of the whole country, the plan to topple a country, these 8 words were really not exaggerated at all. At all costs. These 4 words were appropriate. But what Li Tianlan didn't know was that Zhongzhou State was going all out in this battle, and the Eastern Theater of Operations of Zhongzhou State was even more so. What Ning Qianqing didn't say or was unwilling to say, was that in this battle General Ning Ziyuan, the commander of the Eastern Theater of Operations of Zhongzhou State, had almost lost his mind. Among the hundreds of thousands of troops in the entire Eastern Theater of Operations, Ning Ziyuan had mobilized more than 90% of the Fire Flaming Realm experts for this battle. Even if it was for the sake of victory, such a method could almost be called deranged. Ning Qianqing couldn't comment on his father's behavior, and he didn't care to. So he simply said nothing. "It's really?" Li Tianlan sighed while smoking. When he was about to speak, he saw the pale-faced horsewoman hurrying over. Horsewoman's aura was still a little weak, but she moved fast. After the battle in the forest, she looked at Li Tianlan with a little gentleness in her eyes, but what she said suddenly made Li Tianlan stand up. The final battle is about to begin. On the morning of June 27th. Even under the full suppression of the official of East Island, the news still swept through the entire dark world in a very short time like a hurricane. Samsara was looking forward to it, Zhongzhou State was looking forward to it, and countless people were looking forward to it. Although some things came late, they were never absent. Gong Sun Chi, General of 9 Heavens and Azure Dragon of Zhongzhou State, hadn't arrived in Jubin yet. Ning Qianqing and all the elites of Zhongzhou State hadn't made a move yet. Under such circumstances, all the defense lines and defense nodes around Changdao were attacked almost at the same time. Lightning and fire lit up in every direction around Changdao. All the experts of the dark world appeared in Changdao, either inside or outside Changdao. Before Zhongzhou State took any action, all the defense lines around Changdao collapsed almost in an instant and were scattered by the impact. In the chaos, the elites of the superpowers and the elites of Zhongzhou State directly broke through the blockade of East Island. They marched straight in. It was the beginning of the final battle of Changdao, the beginning of the struggle for the general trend. This was a disaster for East Island, but it was a feast for the dark world. In the chaos, the forces of the dark world began to step onto the stage of Changdao one after another. All the people in the world attacked East Island together. This chapter was written yesterday, so there was at least one chapter today. He hurriedly glanced at the circle of readers. It seemed that a brother said, "I won't reply to messages." He felt guilty and really didn't dare to read it. He was too ashamed to read it. Once he read it, he would definitely explode. He hurriedly glanced at it and didn't see the whole content clearly. Chapter 186. Undercurrents were surging in the dark world. Zhongzhou State was not peaceful either. In the whole late June, in a hidden place unknown to the world, countless seemingly accidental but inevitable things were running in an intense and orderly manner. Jianghu State, East Island, Northern Europe, North America. In the tense atmosphere of an impending storm, the whole dark world seemed to have formed a big picture and a general trend. It was unpredictable and unsure. For the people in the game of Jianghu State, they spent most of the last half of June in meetings. The meetings of the Decision-Making Committee, the Army Headquarters, the Special Warfare Conference of Kunlun City, the internal meetings of various combat agencies, and the joint meetings of various agencies. Busy. Under the calm surface, everyone was busy. Yes. Nothing happened, but everyone had a sense of chaos that was extremely uncomfortable. But there was order in the chaos. Almost every time after the end of a meeting, the whole plan of Jianghu State would take a step forward. Under the appearance of chaos, every step was very clear and stable. Although the general trend was chaotic, everyone in the game of Jianghu State was full of confidence. The special warfare forces of the whole Jianghu State seemed to be in a state of extreme madness. For the beautiful future, Jianghu State used all its resources and suppressed all the possibilities of failure to the minimum. Then it was devotion. Constant devotion. And in the process of the whole country plotting against East Island, General Ning Ziyuan, the commander of the Eastern Theater of Operations of Jianghu State, was undoubtedly the craziest one. His actions even surprised all the insiders in the country, and they were even dumbfounded. As the strongest supporter of the plot to overturn the country, among the first batch of nearly 2,000 special warfare elites of Jianghu State that sneaked into East Island, almost 500 of the most powerful elites were from the Eastern Theater of Operations. Among the 5 theaters of operations, Kunlun City, various special warfare agencies, and the 2 special warfare academies, the Eastern Theater of Operations directly took out a quarter of its manpower. Just when everyone thought it was crazy enough, the list of the second batch of elites sneaking into East Island was sent to everyone in the game. Everyone's first thought when they saw the list was that Ning Ziyuan was crazy. Among the 600 Fire Flaming Realm experts, 118 were from the Eastern Theater of Operations. And there seemed to be less than 130 Fire Flaming Realm experts in the entire Eastern Theater of Operations. What did they want to do? Including the first batch of 500 elites who were sent away at this moment, the elite combat power of the Eastern Theater of Operations could be said to be at a low point that had not been seen for decades. Among the 5 theaters of operations in Jianghu State, the Eastern Theater of Operations had always been recognized as a large theater of operations whose comprehensive strength was second only to the Central Theater of Operations. But with Ning Ziyuan's 2 decisions, the status of the Eastern Theater of Operations plummeted, and it almost fell to the bottom of the 5 theaters of operations. Moreover, this kind of strength was destined to be a strength that could not be made up for in a short period of time. After all, it wasn't as simple as sending people to East Island. When people were sent out, the files of the elite soldiers belonging to the Eastern Theater of Operations would also be destroyed in the database of the Eastern Theater of Operations. From this point of view, every elite of the Eastern Theater of Operations who entered East Island could actually be regarded as a member of the Snowdance Corps. Even if the Southeast Group wanted to use this force to control part of the Snowdance Corps' right to speak, they didn't need to send people over when the war was about to break out. After all, the Snowdance Corps was mainly under the command of Kunlun City. When the war started, Kunlun City could make hundreds of elites belonging to the Eastern Theater of Operations suffer heavy losses with a little effort. The Southeast Group definitely understood this. But why did they do this time? If all this was just because Ning Ziyuan was selfless and devoted to his country, even a fool would not believe it. But after everyone in the game observed the major groups in Jianghu State, it was hard for them to detect any undercurrents. Although people intuitively felt that this was a game between the Southeast Group, the Special Warfare Group, and even more groups, now at least on the surface, the major groups were united and working hard for the plan of Jianghu State. At least, President Li Huaqing had praised Ning Ziyuan's spirit of serving his country wholeheartedly on different occasions. However, Ning Ziyuan's behind-the-scenes boss, Wang Tianzong, patriarch of the Wang family of Beihai, had been silent. Wang Tianzong became more and more silent. Gradually, the eyes of some people with ulterior motives shifted to Ning Ziyuan. The general trend in the dark world was fluctuating, but Jianghu State was completely normal. But this seemingly normal was the biggest abnormality. When the general trend in the distance attracted everyone's attention, there would often be some quiet changes around them. They were not obvious, but they might be extremely important. More and more people began to study Ning Ziyuan. He was low-key, silent, forbearing, kind, tough to the outside world, weak to the inside world, good at compromise and giving up, good at dealing with complicated situations. This was Ning Ziyuan in everyone's impression. In the past many years he had been like this. But now, it seemed to be the same. The afterglow of the setting sun cast the last trace of light on the horizon. The bright moon had just risen, and the setting sun had not disappeared. Darkness and dim yellow diffused in the forward and backward movement. In the courtyard of the Eastern Theater of Operations in the ancient capital of Jinling, Ning Ziyuan, dressed in a neat military uniform, walked quietly to his number 3 building. Along the way, the patrolling guards occasionally saluted him, and Ning Ziyuan always returned the salute meticulously. His actions were not perfunctory at all. This general, who could be said to be a top figure in the military of Jianghu state, had an ordinary figure and appearance. In the trance of the approaching night, his military uniform with military ranks did not seem to enhance his aura at all. Instead, it made him look more low-key. Most of the time, Ning Ziyuan's expression was peaceful. He was not serious, deep, kind, or ordinary. Instead, he gave people the feeling that he was thinking about something seriously. The outside world's evaluation of him was either weak, low-key, or disdainful, but his control over the Eastern Theater of Operations had never been doubted at all. In the compromises over the years, the real power figures from other groups in the Eastern Theater of Operations had changed again and again, but no one had really made Ning Ziyuan suffer a loss. Even Tan Qinghua, a powerful general of the Prince Group, did not gain any advantage in the battle with Ning Ziyuan. Not only did his son die, but he was also forced to leave the Eastern Theater of Operations, which he had been operating for several years, alone. All these results were achieved by Ning Ziyuan's seemingly compromised step by step. Such means could simply be called wisdom. This military general, who was deeply trusted by Wang Tianzong, was definitely a real power figure worthy of careful study by anyone. But imperceptibly, he had become a figure that everyone would subconsciously ignore. In the darkness he moved faster and faster. Ning Ziyuan passed by the patrolling guards and continued to walk to his residence. The guards stood there and looked at Ning Ziyuan for a long time. Then they shook their heads and continued to patrol. The transfer of a large number of elite experts in the Eastern Theater of Operations was not a secret. Although ordinary soldiers did not know where these people were transferred to, their departure from the Eastern Theater of Operations could not be hidden from everyone. In the last few days of June, not only the top officials in the entire Jianghu state were studying Ning Ziyuan, but even the guards in the Eastern Theater of Operations were also deeply curious about Ning Ziyuan's series of actions. Ning Ziyuan reached out to open the door of the 3rd building and walked into the hall. His wife was usually not here, and his son had already fallen out with him. It seemed that they would never see each other again. On weekdays only he lived in this 2-story wooden building. It was so quiet that it was almost cold. Ning Ziyuan had long been used to this state. He walked past the porch and was about to turn on the light. The light is too bright. It's dazzling. A voice suddenly sounded from the living room. It was light, soft, and warm. The person's control of the voice was almost superb. The voice floated into Ning Ziyuan's ears and did not continue to spread backward. Ning Ziyuan's palm that was pressing the light switch slightly paused. The last ray of the setting sun outside the window completely dissipated. The light and shadow in the hall were hazy and silent. Ning Ziyuan calmly walked into the living room. Through the light and shadow, he vaguely saw the outline of a human figure sitting on the sofa in the living room. He just sat there quietly. He didn't drink the water, nor did he touch the fruit platter in front of him. He just sat there. This is not a place where you should be. Ning Ziyuan walked over and sat down opposite him, frowning. In the darkness, the black shadow who had been sitting there for God knows how long laughed silently. The meaning was unclear. Ning Ziyuan also seemed to feel that his words were a little inappropriate. He blew down his eyelids and said calmly, "At least for now, this is not a place where you should be. If something happens, we can contact each other through emergency channels, or we can meet somewhere else. It's always safer than here. I know you've been busy recently. And now I don't know how many people are watching you. Now, I'm afraid that the number of times you go to the bathroom will be recorded, right? How about it? Are you under a lot of pressure? Can you handle it?" The black shadow chuckled. In the darkness, his voice became softer and softer, with a very warm sense of intimacy. "I'm okay." Ning Ziyuan sighed, shook his head and said, "There's always pressure. But I have to do what I have to do." He reached out and rubbed his temples, then took out a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to the black shadow in front of him. "My head hurts. I hope I can sleep well tonight. If there's nothing else, leave immediately. Every second you stay here, I'll be on tenterhooks for another second." "It's okay." The black shadow shook his head gently and said with a smile, You've already mobilized almost all the masters in the theater, and the others can't find my traces. Moreover, it's just nightfall, so it's not a good time to leave even if I want to. I'll leave when it's late." Ning Ziyuan frowned and didn't say anything. The Black Shadow lowered his head and unfolded the A4 paper. In the darkness, the A4 paper was vaguely filled with words. They seemed to be names, and almost every name was marked with some simple symbols in black and red. A dark blue electric light flashed in front of the Black Shadow. The light illuminated the names on the paper and then went out in an instant. Although I already know the result, I have to say that you're really crazy this time. It's worth it for us to take the risk to meet tonight just for this list. The Black Shadow shook his head and sighed, and his tone became softer. Ning Ziyuan snorted and said nothing. "How did you convince Tianzong?" The Black Shadow suddenly asked, with pure curiosity and no malice in his tone. Ning Ziyuan shook his head. "He hasn't been right recently. I guess he's worried about Xingxiao. I made this decision and Tianzong hasn't even talked to me. After all, it's the power of Zhongzhou State. It belongs to the Southeast Group, but it can't be said to be the private army of the Southeast Group. The president has expressed his position, so it's not convenient for him to say more." In the dark, the Black Shadow pondered for a while and then nodded. "Xingxiao. Firmament and Black Pupil have been in East Island for almost a week. In addition, Kunlun City can't sit still anymore. Ice Crystal and Ice Frost seem to have left Zhongzhou State. Hey, they all want to find their heirs. If they knew this, they wouldn't have done it." Ning Ziyuan was silent. "This list," the Black Shadow hesitated slightly. "Is this your decision? After I leave today, it'll be too late for you to regret it." Now what?" Ning Ziyuan said blandly. "Regret? Am I qualified?" The Black Shadow fell silent. Did Ning Ziyuan have the right to regret it? No one could give a definite answer to this question except for himself. You, on the other hand, should think about the future. When everything comes to the surface, where will you go? Ning Ziyuan said blandly. "Slave of 3 surnames, that's not a good title. Bullsh *T slave of 3 surnames." The Black Shadow sneered. "I only have one standpoint. Has it changed after so many years?" In the dark, the two of them were silent. "Anyway, we've paid so much. One day we'll get what we want." After a long time, the Black Shadow spoke softly, and his tone was a little erratic. "I believe you." Ning Ziyuan nodded, but his tone was a little cold. "But compared with what we pay and what we want, is it really worth it? Especially for you? Worth it? Not worth it? Worth it?" The Black Shadow murmured a few times and suddenly sneered. "So what if it's worth it or not? Dead people are dead." His tone was cold, but there was a kind of deep sorrow and guilt in the coldness of indifference. Ning Ziyuan's mouth moved. He couldn't see the Black Shadow's face clearly, so he didn't dare to look at it for a moment. "I'm sorry," the general opened his mouth and said in a dry and hoarse voice, "I'm sorry for what I did to you. That year, it was my decision for the overall situation." The Black Shadow shook his head and said in a low voice, "If you have the chance, say thank you to Qianqing for me." Ning Ziyuan shook his head with a bitter smile and said nothing more. "I'll take the list with me." The Black Shadow stood up and waved the list in his hand. "Someone wants me to say thank you to you." "Who?" Ning Ziyuan's eyes suddenly froze. "Anyone. This thank you, everyone should say it to you. You have no qualms about it." In the indifferent words, there seemed to be light faintly shining into the hall outside the window. The darkness in the living room receded, and the Black Shadow holding the list had completely disappeared. Ning Ziyuan sat where he was, and the general rank shone with a majestic golden light in the night. He sighed deeply, tired and powerless like a statue full of cracks. At the same time, Yuzhou, Diaoyutai State Guest House. A specially modified Mercedes-Benz slowly drove into the antique gate of the guest house under the escort of several other cars, and finally stopped in front of building number 12. The well-trained driver got out of the car immediately. After instinctively looking around, he bent over and opened the door of the back seat. A tall and thin middle-aged man got out of the car and buttoned his black suit casually. The middle-aged man looked about 40 years old. His face was thin and handsome, and his expression was indifferent. His lips were slightly pursed and he looked extremely determined. The most attractive thing was his eyes. In the night, he raised his head and looked at the light in front of building number 12. His eyes were like the abyss, wise and deep, calm and unfathomable. A quiet and well-behaved girl followed the middle-aged man out of the car. Blinking her big eyes, she looked at the guest house in front of her curiously and asked, Dad, why did you bring me here? The sound of high-heeled shoes hitting the ground rang in the building. A woman who looked extremely elegant and gentle appeared in front of building number 12. Wearing a pair of gold-rimmed glasses, the woman was pretty and charming. She had completely shed all her immaturity, and she looked mature and intellectual. Every move of hers carried the charm and confidence of a mature woman. Ning? Why are you here? The quiet girl next to the middle-aged man opened her eyes wide. The woman, who no longer looked immature but could hardly be associated with the word aunt, was also stunned. Then she smiled sweetly and said, Xinyan, why don't you stay in Huading? What are you doing here? Were you tricked by your dad? Let me tell you, it's not too late for you to leave now. Your dad is up to no good. He probably tricked you to come here for a blind date. There are several young talents from Europe and North America upstairs. They are all first-class handsome men, but... She paused and looked at the middle-aged man in front of her with a smile. Old Han, you've miscalculated this time. Those people upstairs are now surrounding the real goddess. They look like they want to get close to her but don't dare to. It's as if it's a great honor for the goddess to look at them. How can Xinyan have a good impression of them when she sees them like this? At least in my opinion, they are not as pleasing to the eye as our Holong. Professor Ning, you must be joking. The middle-aged man smiled indifferently. Although I, Han Donglu, am not a big shot, my daughter is not reduced to the point of having a blind date. Today I just brought Xinyan here to have fun. Ning Xini was the vice president of Huading University, the dean of the business school, a famous economics professor in Zhongzhou State, the daughter-in-law of the Zhang family and Ning Chenqing's aunt. The middle-aged man was Han Donglu, the patriarch of the Han family in Huading. He was the founder of the largest fund in Asia, the Flourishing Age Fund, and a notorious super-financial tycoon in the international financial market. Although the Han family was a neutral wealthy family, they had always been familiar with the Zhang family and had a good personal relationship. If it weren't for the fact that the heirs of the two families, Han Xinyan and Zhang Holong, didn't like each other, the two families might really take this opportunity to unite by marriage. And Ning, what are you talking about? What goddess? A blind date? Han Xinyan was at a loss. Ning Xini chuckled and said mysteriously, You will know when you go up and have a look. Is everyone here? Han Donglu walked into building number 12 and asked casually. It's not the appointed time yet. Ning Xini shook her head. There are still a few who haven't come. The Prime Minister is on his way, and the representative of the Wang family of Beihai is with him. Han Donglu nodded. They came to the door of an exquisite conference room and pushed it open. There were only a few young people sitting in the conference room. There were 3 men and 2 women. Although the conference room wasn't big, there were only 3 people, so it still seemed extremely lonely. The 3 young men in their 30s were all Westerners. They had white skin, blonde or brown hair, were tall, had sword-like eyebrows and starry eyes, and were in high spirits. They were indeed rare handsome men from the West. When Han Donglu and the others came in, a woman who looked to be in her early 20s sat opposite the 3 Westerners, closest to the main seat. She seemed to say something casually. At that moment, the 3 young men who had a strong aura, almost bowed forward at the same time. Even their smiles became eager. The man in the middle with dazzling blonde hair responded to the woman's words as fast as he could. His smile was so bright that it even reminded Han Xinyan of the pug she raised a few years ago that liked to wag its tail at her. The change was so clear and obvious that Han Xinyan opened her mouth subconsciously and looked stunned. She turned her head subconsciously. In her sight, the seat closest to the main seat was a young woman who she couldn't describe at all. She wore a black suit and a white shirt, revealing a part of her snow-white neck. Her long hair was tied up casually. Facing the 3 young men in front of her who were eager to please like a pet dog, her delicate but slightly sharp face was faint, a little cold, but beautiful like a dream. Han Xinyan had never seen such beauty. She was extremely beautiful, the kind of beauty that could make people feel afraid. It was a sense of invasion that was almost irresistible to both men and women. Goddess. Thinking of Ning Xini's evaluation, Han Xinyan nodded subconsciously and agreed with this evaluation in her heart. If there were really goddesses in the world, they would probably be like this. There was a kind of refreshing fragrance in the conference room, natural and rich, like the most rare and elegant natural body fragrance of a woman. Han Xinyan was in a trance. It was not the first time she had seen the woman in front of her. About 2 months ago, she had appeared on the night Ning Chenqing killed Tan Shilai. At that time, someone called her Bosch Qin. She seemed to be that Li Tianlan's woman? Han Xinyan's heart was a little confused for no reason and she felt a little ridiculous. The proud, cold, dreamy woman in front of her also had a man? She tried to shake her head. But Ning Xini had already said with a chuckle, "Everyone, let me introduce." She pointed at Han Donglu and said with a smile, "This is Mr. Han Donglu, the founder of the Flourishing Age Fund. You should be familiar with him, right?" The three Western young men were all stunned and then noticed Han Donglu coming in. Thinking of their performance just now, the three of them seemed to be a little embarrassed, but they still stood up. "Hello, Mr. Han. I'm Luke Habsburg from the Germanic Empire." The young man on the far left stood up with a smile and took the initiative to extend his hand to Han Donglu. His light green eyes looked extremely clear. After coming back to his senses from a trance, his every move seemed to have a very serious style. Han Xinyan felt dizzy. The Habsburg family of the Germanic Empire? In the Germanic Empire and even in the whole of Europe, it was a real giant. Looking at Luke Habsburg's clear and gentle smile, Han Xinyan found it hard to connect him with that, "No, those three pugs just now. I'm Raymond Westminster." The young man on the far right also came over with a smile and shook hands with Han Donglu. His brown hair was neatly combed and seemed to reflect a soft shimmer. He was also elegant. Han Xinyan's mouth twitched again. Westminster was an ancient wealthy family from Star State. Even in the whole of North America, it was enough to be listed as one of the top wealthy families. "I'm Xiao." The young man in the center, who was as handsome as a young god, was the last to speak. Under the dazzling blonde hair was a handsome, aesthetic and confident face. Xiao Rothschild. Han Xinyan's heart was already numb. Rothschild. This family name was more than just a Grand Duke of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. Not to mention the upper class, even a considerable number of ordinary people knew the status of this family name in the world financial market. Giants. These were the real giants. Why did they meet with her father tonight? Han Donglu shook hands with the three of them. His expression was calm and his tone was extremely polite. "This is..." Ning Xini hesitated slightly and said with a smile, "Everyone is in Huading. I don't know if you two have met each other. Mr. Han, this is Qin Weibai Bosch Qin." She paused. She really felt that Qin Weibai's bodyguard, who was like a transparent person, was not someone to be ignored. But she did not know how to introduce him, so she could only vaguely introduce him. "This is Shadowless." Qin Weibai stood up, and a faint smile bloomed on her cold face. "Hello, Boss Han." "Hello, Boss Qin." Han Donglu also gave a simple response. Qin Weibai didn't reach out her hand. Neither did Han Donglu. Chapter 187. Escape. All the way to the north. He didn't know where he was. He had been chased for many days and he spent most of his time struggling and running. It didn't matter where he was now, because Gu Hanshan only knew that he was still in East Island. About a week ago, he passed by the city where he needed emergency supplies. Now he was probably fleeing to the northeast. Other than that, he knew nothing and he didn't care to find out anything. Zhongjing Icehouse Juban Nara Ninghu. In the never-ending chase, Gu Hanshan only remembered that he escaped from one city after another, from the urban area to the wilderness, and then back to the urban area. He rested for supplies for a short time, fought desperately, and fled in a panic. To the north. He could only go north. The days of fleeing had made him lose contact with everyone in Jianghu State. The dark side of East Island was about to rise, but it was still calm on the surface. Gu Hanshan couldn't collect any information, so he didn't know the plan of Jianghu State. He even lost the hunting list at the beginning. He had completely let go of the so-called task and honor. Surviving was the most basic goal. No matter what, he had to survive. The light gradually dimmed. There was no twilight on the horizon. The torrential rain that started from Dongdu had completely covered the whole territory of East Island for days. There had been small-scale tsunamis in several port cities. The sky had been gloomy all the time, from morning to night, and from gloomy to gloomier. In his sight, the undulating barren mountains continued to spread at the end of his sight, and he couldn't see the end. The sky was getting dark, and the whole mountain range seemed to be faintly showing a hint of gloom and horror. The torrential rain fell from the sky, accompanied by the strong wind. Endless weeds rose and fell, and the midsummer air became cold in the rain. There was no light around. Night was coming. Darkness was coming. Desolate, cold, gloomy, and dark. Under the storm, the whole world seemed to have come to an end. Everything in sight seemed to be emitting a kind of doomsday brilliance. Gu Hanshan also seemed to be a little powerless. In the weeds that were half a man's height, he lowered his body, took out a compressed biscuit, tore it open, and stuffed it into his mouth. He swallowed it along with the rain on the horizon. The chase had been going on for nearly half a month. He had been injured several times and fought several times. His supplies had long been used up. Some medicine that could temporarily increase his combat power, medicine that could heal his injuries, and medicine that could replenish his physical strength had been used up about a week ago. Even the compressed biscuits he had now were looted from a supermarket when he risked his life to rush into Jianghu a few days ago. The tragic thing was that the supplies that were looted from the supermarket were now all used up. It was not that Gu Hanshan had not thought of rushing into the city to do something big, but after thinking about it, Gu Hanshan gave up his plan. What could he do if he rushed into the city? At most, he would only be able to control some unimportant hostages, but he would have to risk being discovered by countless people. Jianghu State was plotting against East Island. Now every city in East Island was closely monitored by the top. Gu Hanshan could even be 100% sure that once he went to the city, his whereabouts would be exposed within half an hour. At that time, even if he controlled more hostages, so what? In the battle of the Dark World, hostages were never the most important. Only some barren mountains with complicated terrain were the best route for him to escape. But he was not desperate in a desperate situation. In the dark storm, Gu Hanshan's figure was hidden in the grass, and he swallowed the last bit of food in his mouth expressionlessly. The deep exhaustion and weakness almost seeped out from his bone marrow. Gu Hanshan felt that he would fall down at any time. The darkness filled the sky. Between reality and illusion, he also felt that his eyes went black for a while. He shook his head hard, sat up in the grass, and began to meditate. Meditation was the fastest way to recover spirit. Gu Hanshan had the heavenly king heart. When he entered the meditative state from the silent state, his speed was completely incredible. Because of this, he had enough willpower to drag his tired body to run for so long, and he even had a slight breakthrough in martial arts. But as time went by, Gu Hanshan had more and more clearly understood that it seemed that this kind of persistence was coming to an end. The hunt from the superior of the half-step invincible realm was getting fiercer and faster. No matter how fast he ran and how sensitive he was to danger, this was East Island after all, and the opponent could use countless resources to lock his position immediately. 3 days. 3 days at most, and then he might really be at the end of his road. He meditated for less than 10 minutes. Gu Hanshan had opened his eyes quickly. He sat up in the grass, lowered his body, and started to move forward toward the endless mountain range ahead. 10 minutes of rest was luxurious enough, and it was also risky enough. 3 hours ago, he escaped from Tengu, the superior of the half-step invincible realm, who was chasing him. 20 minutes ago he got rid of him. During this time, it was enough for the opponent to lock his position again. But Gu Hanshan had to stop. He really couldn't hold on any longer. The footsteps in the grass were getting faster and faster. Suppressing the feeling of blackness and dizziness, Gu Hanshan clenched his fists and went all the way north. He couldn't determine his specific location now, but he could roughly understand that after crossing the endless mountain range in front of him and continuing to go forward for dozens of kilometers, he should be able to reach Toyama or New Island. As long as he was careful enough, he could take a boat from any port in these two places and continue to go north to the south of Beihai Province in Jianghu State. Although the Wang family of Beihai and Kunlun City weren't on good terms, with the former's magnanimity, he wouldn't run into trouble if he fled there. As long as he went ashore in Beihai Province, he would be safe. But this time, the task and the competition with Wang Xingxiao, Gu Hanshan didn't bother to think about it. Speed up. Climb the mountain. Gu Hanshan clenched his teeth and moved faster and faster. In the heavy rain, thunder rolled across the sky, and the mountain seemed to be trembling in the thunder. Pale lightning flashed across the dark sky. The crisis was like an exploding tide, shrouding Gu Hanshan in an instant. There was no time to think. The blazing, solid bright fire instantly covered Gu Hanshan's whole body. The flames surged wildly. The moment the fire lit up, his body rushed forward. At the same time, a large piece of blue lightning fell directly from the top of Gu Hanshan's head. The large piece of fire was smashed by the lightning, splashing sparks and falling on the grassland soaked by the wind and rain. The water vapor was evaporated in an instant, and the wild grass burned wildly. The bleak night was illuminated by the warm fire. In the fire, Gu Hanshan's firm face seemed to be pale and transparent. Heavenly Hound, the left advisor of Wuji Palace, who took action as soon as the thunder sounded, floated in the air expressionlessly. A large amount of lightning swayed around him. Standing in the air, he looked mysterious and powerful, but his face was abnormally pale. Countless bolts of lightning struck the fire on Gu Hanshan's body, and the fire grew. Finally, when the fire disappeared, the lightning in front of Heavenly Hound also disappeared at the same time. Only the sparks that fell on the ground were still spreading rapidly. The fire quickly burned the wild grass about 10 meters around Gu Hanshan, and then it was extinguished by the rain. Thick smoke billowed. Heavenly Hound stared at Gu Hanshan through the thick smoke. The corners of his mouth rose slightly with cruelty and resentment. He said softly, "Run, keep running. Do you think you can still run away?" Gu Hanshan looked at Heavenly Hound in front of him quietly and said flatly, "Do you think you can catch up with me?" The corners of Heavenly Hound's mouth twitched fiercely, and the fire of anger in his eyes suddenly burned. "I can't catch up with you. If I wanted to kill you, you could have died at least 10 times in so many days. The young heavenly son of Jianghu state? Oh bullshit." Gu Hanshan was expressionless and did not speak. He knew that Heavenly Hound was telling the truth. So what if he was a young heavenly son? The realm gap between them was so huge that it couldn't be made up. If Heavenly Hound didn't want to catch him alive, Gu Hanshan would have died long ago in the continuous pursuit. In the isolation of the fire and the thick smoke, Gu Hanshan seemed to squint slightly, and a strange light flashed in his eyes. He didn't bother to think why Heavenly Hound wanted to catch him alive. There were only a few reasons. He wouldn't be so arrogant to think that he was the best in the world, but he had never belittled himself. His talent and his identity were enough to make him one of the most important people among all the people from Jianghu state who sneaked into East Island this time. This kind of importance was undoubtedly a bargaining chip in the eyes of the people from East Island. Once he fell into the hands of the people from East Island, he would become a very important bargaining chip in the hands of East Island. At that time, East Island would have enough confidence to use him as a bargaining chip to negotiate with Jianghu state or trade with Kunlun city. Gu Hanshan took a deep breath. He suddenly felt grateful for his identity, and it was precisely because of this identity that he could seize the opportunity. Yes, it was an opportunity. The continuous struggle between life and death for many days squeezed out a lot of his potential. Gu Hanshan, who was already at the peak of the fire-flaming realm, finally made further progress. Although he didn't completely enter the thunder-shocking realm, he had half of his foot in that realm. The gap between the half-step thunder-shocking realm and the half-step invincible realm was still huge. But Gu Hanshan had the core of Kunlun City's 10 skills of true martial arts, especially the 9th secluded impasse. That move could be regarded as the pseudo-domain in the invincible realm. Gu Hanshan was barely able to use it when he was at the peak of the fire-flaming realm. After he reached the half-step thunder-shocking realm, he had a deeper understanding of this move. In fact, after such a long pursuit, almost all the injuries on Heavenly Hound were caused by Gu Hanshan in the pseudo-domain of the 9th secluded impasse. Superiors of the half-step invincible realm could also vaguely form pseudo-domains. But in terms of domains, the inheritance of 10 skills of true martial arts was far better than that of Heavenly Hound. Heavenly Hound's pseudo-domain only existed a little longer than that of the 9th secluded impasse. But at the moment when the pseudo-domains of the two sides collided, Gu Hanshan would rush up and fight with Heavenly Hound several times without hesitation. That was a way of fighting in which both sides would suffer or even perish together. Heavenly Hound didn't want to die, so he could only get injured in defense. In half a month, Heavenly Hound was consuming Gu Hanshan's physical strength and willpower, and Gu Hanshan was also consuming Heavenly Hound's state. There was another move, the 9th secluded impasse. Gu Hanshan narrowed his eyes slightly, and there seemed to be some hesitation in his eyes. Based on the current state of both sides, once the 9th secluded impasse appeared, Gu Hanshan had at least a 40% chance to kill Heavenly Hound, and a 20% chance to retreat with serious injuries. In this way, Gu Hanshan himself didn't know how much chance he had to kill Heavenly Hound and retreat with serious injuries. It must not be high. But this kind of low chance was quite worth a try in the current desperate situation. A bit of fire gradually bloomed between Gu Hanshan's hands. In the barren mountain where the fire had been extinguished by the rain, the extremely horrifying high temperature instantly rose. The heavy rain was still falling, but it had been completely evaporated before it reached Gu Hanshan's head. That bit of fire spread slowly and elegantly, enveloping Gu Hanshan's palm, and then covering his right arm. Gu Hanshan still looked at Heavenly Hound calmly. Faint but extremely strong killing intent had risen and diffused with the raging fire, spreading between heaven and earth. Heavenly Hound's eyes suddenly shrank. He narrowed his eyes and sneered, "What? Are you going to fight with your life? Do you think you deserve it?" Gu Hanshan didn't say a word. His body suddenly took a step forward. In an instant, Heavenly Hound thought of the 9th secluded impasse that he had encountered several times in the past half a month, the 10 skills of true martial arts of Kunlun City, and Gu Hanshan's constantly increasing strength. Almost instinctively, Heavenly Hound sensed the danger and suddenly took a step back. "You don't dare to fight?" Gu Hanshan slightly raised his eyebrows, and there seemed to be a trace of mockery in his calm tone. Heavenly Hound's face suddenly turned red, and he flew into a rage. But before he could speak, another voice had suddenly sounded in the void. "He doesn't dare, but we do." In the sky dozens of meters away, the deep blue lightning suddenly flashed, subtle and dim. Gu Hanshan's hair suddenly stood on end. Although the lightning was dozens of meters away, the unprecedented danger seemed to have appeared around him. "Retreat." The raging fire suddenly rose to the sky, and the airflow suddenly twisted. The weeds on the ground and the ashes after burning all flew up in an instant. In front of Gu Hanshan, a large area of space seemed to be compressed violently, and the air was forcibly squeezed out and turned into airwaves. His body retreated to a safe distance of 20 meters away with the impact of the airwaves in the blink of an eye, and the sound of violent compression kept coming from that twisted space. 9th secluded impasse. That pseudo-domain covered the space with a radius of more than 10 meters. A large piece of deep blue light rushed into the pseudo-domain at a fast speed. The lightning suddenly became stagnant. A man in a standard ninja costume floated in the air when the lightning dissipated. His hands holding the dagger struggled subconsciously, and his eyes were shocked. The opportunity was lost. Gu Hanshan had no time to be upset or rejoice. He turned around and left without hesitation. His body turned in the dark. A pair of playful and charming eyes appeared directly in front of Gu Hanshan. The two of them were so close that the moment he turned around, Gu Hanshan almost kissed her directly. He forcibly stopped himself, and his face suddenly changed dramatically. He didn't know when a woman in black suddenly appeared behind him. Gu Hanshan didn't know how long she had been standing behind him. If he hadn't turned around, he would even think that there was nothing behind him. This was a woman who looked to be in her 30s. She had a very stylish short hair. Because the two of them were so close, Gu Hanshan could even see the fine wrinkles at the corners of her eyes on her face that was no longer young. But this was not an ugly woman. Gu Hanshan completely subconsciously stepped back and tilted his head back. The woman's face suddenly appeared completely in his sight. It was a very mature and charming face, full of charm, with a very frivolous and flirtatious look, but not the slightest bit of killing intent. Gu Hanshan's body just took a step back, and in an instant he was pulled forward again. The woman's face became bigger in his sight again. A pair of soft arms hooked around his neck, and a mouth with a little fragrance directly pressed on his lips. It was a brief touch. Before Gu Hanshan could react, the woman who kissed him giggled and said softly in a sweet voice that sounded like a girl's panting, "9th secluded impasse? Good unique skill, but it's a pity that you are too young." The sharp pain instantly spread all over his body. There was lightning flashing in front of Gu Hanshan. Vaguely, he only saw a pair of tender white palms surrounded by lightning covering his chest slowly and gently. Bang! In the dull sound, Gu Hanshan spat out a mouthful of blood. His body flew more than 10 meters into the sky, and finally fell heavily at the feet of the black-clothed ninja in the 9th secluded impasse. Gu Hanshan gritted his teeth and struggled to stand up, but his body was getting weaker and weaker. Heavenly Hound, who was also a little sluggish because of the series of changes, finally reacted. With a trace of fear and unconcealable anger in his tone, he said coldly, "Demon Black Crow, what do you mean?" The black-clothed ninja code-named Black Crow said nothing. Then he put away the two daggers in his hands and looked at Gu Hanshan, who was struggling at his feet, thoughtfully. However, the charming and frivolous woman chuckled and said softly, "Heavenly Hound, you are too incompetent. Your ability to handle matters has disappointed everyone. So, Liuhua Palace will take over the task of hunting Gu Hanshan." Demon, the deputy palace master of Liuhua Palace in East Island, was one of the top ninjas in the whole Dark World, and a superior a half-step to Invincible Realm. And Black Crow, who acted with her, was the top superior ninja of Liuhua Palace. His strength was close to the peak of the Thunder-Shocking Realm, so he could not be ignored either. Incompetent. If it weren't for you guys, I would have caught him in one day at most. You guys are... Heavenly Hound was completely furious. Gu Hanshan was also a very important figure in Zhongzhou State. He was known as the young heavenly son. Catching him was definitely a great achievement. At the same time, he was also an extremely difficult young opponent. Heavenly Hound had chased him for so long. Seeing that Gu Hanshan couldn't hold on any longer, Liuhua Palace suddenly jumped out to take his credit and said that he was incompetent? Heavenly Hound almost fell from the air. His body trembled violently and he stared at Demon, who was smiling charmingly, and gnashed his teeth. However, before he could finish speaking, Chi Mei had already interrupted him coldly. One day? Does Wuji Palace have no concept of time? Heavenly Hound, how chaotic is East Island now? One day. Humph, maybe in half a day the special warfare system of East Island will be dismantled by those superiors from all over the world. His Highness Miyamoto, even the imperial family and the office of the Prime Minister can't tolerate your incompetence anymore. Otherwise, Black Crow and I wouldn't have taken action. Do you think we are willing to take your credit? His Highness Miyamoto, the imperial family, the office of the Prime Minister. Heavenly Hound's face changed from red to white, and he was so embarrassed that he wanted to hide himself. No matter what, I chased him here. Even without you guys, he can't run away. Demon, give me Gu Hanshan and let me take him back to Wuji Palace. Then I'll forget what happened tonight. Heavenly Hound kept silent for 5 minutes and then slowly said, Wuji Palace? Demon smiled softly and shook her head. I think he's more suitable to be a guest in Liuhua Palace. Heavenly Hound raised his eyebrows. Before he could say anything, another abrupt voice rang out. We think he's more suitable to go to Changdao. It was perfect Chinese. Demon's smile froze and her face suddenly changed. She screamed, Black Crow. Her words were hurried and high-pitched, but it was too late. A bone-chilling sword intent suddenly spread all over the barren mountain. The sword intent was surging and condensing. The sword momentum was silent. The wild wind in the air suddenly blew violently and turned into a storm. All the weeds around were swept up into the sky, flying messily. The turbulent airflow surged wildly. Demon closed her eyes subconsciously. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. For ice walls suddenly rose up around Gu Hanshan. Along with the appearance of the ice walls, there were 2 rays of sword light that were as cold as glaciers. 2 beams of sword light silently flashed out from the swaying weeds. Everyone's eyes flashed faintly, and the 2 beams of sword light directly merged into one. Demon had just screamed when the 2 rays of sword light rushed to the front of Black Crow. Bright and sharp lightning burst out in front of the sword light, accompanied by blood and broken ice all over the sky. The ice walls around Gu Hanshan were instantly broken, and so was Black Crow's body. The sword light was like lightning, drawing a 100-meter-long icy straight line in the barren mountain. 2 figures hid under a ray of sword light, grabbed Gu Hanshan, and kept moving forward in the flashing lightning and sword light. In the blink of an eye, they flew nearly 100 meters away. Both Demon and Heavenly Hound seemed to be confused for a moment. Clap! The broken ice all over the sky fell to the ground with blood and flesh. Demon's body suddenly shook and she suddenly reacted. She screamed, Who the hell is it? Heavenly Hound's face was solemn and gloomy. People from Kunlun City. Ice Frost. He took a deep breath, gave Demon a hard look and turned to leave. Where are you going? Chi Mei let out a shrill scream. Back to Wuji Palace. Heavenly Hound said coldly, If you are not afraid of death, go after him. Demon gritted her teeth and looked at Heavenly Hound's back, motionless. Ice Frost. These 2 code names might be a little strange in the dark world, but if they were combined, they would be really well known. Kunlun City. Ice Soul and Ice Frost Sword. They might be the most famous pair of twin brothers in the dark world. Both of them were only superiors at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. But they had the sharpness that made most superiors of the half-step invincible realm retreat. Demon's eyes flickered for a while, but she didn't go after them. After all, like Heavenly Hound, she didn't want to die. Chapter 188. Defeat. When the ultimate attack in the perfect defense failed, any superior, no matter the young heavenly son or the superior of the half-step invincible realm, could only be defeated and then walked on the road of defeat and death. From Wakayama to Changdao they crossed thousands of miles, covered in blood and fled in defeat. The heavy rain fell hysterically in the forest with crazy momentum. The heavy rain lasted for several days and the forest was muddy everywhere. The wet and slippery ground had a slight upward slope like a low hill. When going up against the slope, one needed to maintain physical strength and couldn't fly in the air. Every step was extremely uncomfortable. The rumbling footsteps behind him were getting closer and closer, as if thousands of horses and soldiers were galloping. The rapidly falling raindrops surrounded the entire forest, but it was difficult to cover the charging footsteps. It was as if thunder was striking the ground, and the dull, thunderous footsteps reverberated continuously, causing the entire forest to tremble. Swift, fierce, tireless, and full of killing intent. In their sight, a metal monster at least 2 meters tall was moving straight all the way. The trees in front of him didn't seem to exist in his eyes, and they were broken in the straight way. One by one the trees kept falling as he moved forward. The clear cracking sound of tree trunks broke through the sound of the rain, and now it was particularly ear-piercing. Damn it again? Doesn't this monster have any weakness? In front of the forest, Wang Xingxiao, the heir of the Wang family of Beihai, known as the strongest expert of the young generation in Jianghu state, looked at the tall figure rushing toward him. The corner of his mouth twitched slightly, and he finally couldn't help but swear. This young prodigy, who was gentle most of the time, had a pale face. His clothes were tattered, dirty, and stained with mud and blood. He looked like a beggar, but his mental state was not bad. At the very least, when he cursed, he was full of energy. If he really had a weakness, he wouldn't be the leader of the Kusanagi force. A woman in black stood beside Wang Xingxiao and said in a flat tone. Black seemed to be the woman's biggest feature. She wore black clothes, black shoes, black hair, and even her skin was dark. The woman wasn't beautiful because her appearance was too plain, and it was hard to tell her age. This was a woman who wouldn't attract attention anywhere, but she had a pair of extremely weird eyes. Black eyes. Her eyes were huge, but there was no white in her pupils. They were all black, and a faint luster flickered in her pupils. They were dim and gloomy like a malicious spirit, making people shudder. She stood quietly beside Wang Xingxiao, watching the metal monster approaching, motionless. Run. They were indeed running, but running in front of this monster was a joke in this kind of weather. This was a monster that had been modified to the point where it was no longer human. It knew no exhaustion, never gave up, and had absolute defense and attack power. In this kind of environment, running away with their backs facing it was equivalent to seeking death. The woman narrowed her eyes, which were so creepy and chilling. She looked at the metal monster that was getting closer and closer. Her dark face was abnormally pale and even a little blue. She looked extremely weak. In such a state, no one could tell that she was a top master in the dark world. Black pupil from the Wang family of Beihai. Within the Wang family of Beihai, which was full of experts and had a deep foundation, her strength might not be at the top, but she was very close to it. An expert who was extremely close to the half-step invincible realm, even if there was no room for improvement, would be the top existence in any superpower. Energy. A deep voice suddenly sounded, calm and hoarse. A middle-aged man who looked like he was in his 40s stood on the other side of Wang Xingxiao. From his position he was even a little closer to Wang Xingxiao and Black Pupil. That was the position where he could withstand the most attacks and fight back first. Once the battle broke out, he could minimize the attacks on the two people behind him. The man was a little short and fat. The expression on his round face was calm, but there seemed to be lightning flashing in the depths of his eyes. He looked calm and intense. Closer. Closer and closer. In the heavy rain, the metal armor on the metal monster that was rushing toward them had begun to deform slightly. Almost in the blink of an eye, it changed from the charging form to the fighting form. The muzzle on the shoulder, the saber on the arm, and the gun barrel on the finger were exposed one by one. 50 meters. 30 meters. The rain hit the armor crazily. The armor made of special alloy shone with a cold and sharp light, with a smell of death. 20 meters. The man suddenly reached out and whispered, "Young master, the sword." Without hesitation, Wang Xingxiao directly threw the broad-bladed heavy sword that weighed more than 50 kilograms to the middle-aged man in front of him. The sword was named Firmament. The middle-aged man's code name in the Wang family of Beihai was also Firmament. It was not a coincidence that he had the same name as the sword. Wang Xingxiao, who had the wind and thunder veins, held the Firmament sword, and Firmament himself was Wang Xingxiao's guardian since childhood. He was the top expert of the half-step invincible realm. Even in the Wang family of Beihai, in terms of combat capability, Firmament could be ranked in the top 5. The heavy greatsword slashed through the air, bringing with it a dull whistling sound. Firmament's fingers bent slightly. In the air flow, the sword hilt fell directly into his hand. In an instant, Firmament's eyes stood up, and the lightning flashing in the depths of his eyes burst out without reservation. Firmament held the firmament. The rain all over the sky suddenly quieted down. The pseudo-domain of the superior of the half-step invincible realm spread out in an instant. An extremely violent sword intent suddenly burst out from the sword tip of firmament and rushed straight into the sky. After the metal monster put on the armor, his body, which weighed at least 1,000 kilograms, suddenly slowed down in the pseudo-domain. But the weapons on his body were completely ready for battle. The heavy rain all over the sky stopped for a moment and then became violent in an instant. The crazy raindrops gathered in front of firmament without any pattern. The dazzling lightning burst out from his body and mixed with the rain, directly forming a huge water ball with lightning flashing and expanding in front of the three people. At the same time, all the weapons on the metal monster were aimed at firmament and the other two people. Boom! In the dull roar, the huge body of the metal monster paused. The armor on both sides of his legs and arms suddenly emitted a large amount of gas. Under the full operation of the thrusters, his whole body completely ignored firmament's pseudo-domain and completely approached the water ball that enveloped the three people. Fierce gunshots suddenly rang out. On the metal monster's gloves, every gun barrel was madly spitting out tongues of fire. The rain-like bullets splashed on the water ball around firmament, bringing a large amount of ripples with lightning. His two arm blades had directly pierced into the water ball under the huge force. This was a confrontation between technology and force. There was no communication, no testing. The moment the two sides approached each other, they went all out to fight to the death. The swollen water ball suddenly shrank the moment the arm blades pierced it, and then it expanded again. A soft but irresistible force pushed the huge body of the metal monster back more than 10 meters. Dense bullets rang through the forest. Firmament took a step forward with the heavy sword in his hand. The sword of Holy Path from the Wang family of Beihai. Without a sound, the whole forest became a world of pure lightning and water. The condensed sword intent instantly burst out in the most thorough and crazy way. This was a sword that completely disregarded any consequences. It pressed forward and swept everything in its path. The air was clearly twisted into ripples visible to the naked eye. With the lightning and water, the completely explosive power spread in all directions with firmament as the center. Lightning shot and water filled the air. In the surging sword intent, the armor on the metal monster's body gradually deformed, and his body kept retreating. The air ripples full of water and lightning hit him again and then swept into the distance, destroying everything around him. After a moment that seemed to last for an eternity, everything in the area of hundreds of meters around firmament turned into dust. All the grass and trees had completely disappeared. The ground mixed with the rain became unprecedentedly smooth and flat. Standing on the mirror-like ground, firmament took another step forward. Blood flowed down from the corner of his mouth, but his eyes became more and more excited. He raised the huge sword slightly, and the second sword strike was about to cut the sky and the earth. In his sight, the armor of the metal monster, who had retreated dozens of meters, had deformed slightly, and the red light flashed in his eyes. Firmament moved forward. He also took a step forward. No fear, no pain, no fatigue. This was the highest achievement of East Island in transforming people, and also the most terrifying war machine. Wang Xingxiao had already turned around and retreated with black pupil. They had experienced similar scenes several times in 5 days. In terms of strength, the metal monster with the code name Captain was definitely no match for Firmament. But it was one thing to beat him and it was another thing to kill him. Captain, who was wrapped in armor, didn't need anything at all. Even if Firmament, a superior a half-step to invincible realm, attacked with all his strength, he could only deform the armor. The armor was made of special alloy, and with some anti-impact materials, Captain in this state could be said to be a real combination of attack and defense. Under the invincible realm, there were many people who could defeat him, but almost no one could kill him in a short time. He was a pure monster. After Wang Xingxiao went missing, Firmament and Black Pupil went to East Island to rescue him, but no one expected that Wang Xingxiao met this monster. The two met Wang Xingxiao 5 days ago, and the change was not big. Before, Wang Xingxiao was being hunted alone, but now, the three of them were being hunted together. Firmament and Black Pupil brought a lot of supplies and news from Jianghu State. After all, Firmament was a superior a half-step to invincible realm. Even if he couldn't kill Captain, his extreme outburst could completely suppress him and consume most of his energy. So, after the three of them gathered together, facing Captain's pursuit, there was no danger. But being chased for hundreds of kilometers, even if there was no danger, it was still a pain in the ass. The heavy sword blade was raised. Firmament didn't look back, but his sharp eyes were filled with extreme determination. They were less than 50 kilometers away from Changdao. After entering Changdao, they could gather with the elites of Jianghu state as soon as possible. Under normal circumstances, the 50 kilometers was enough for Captain to replenish his energy and chase again. But now, Firmament calmly took a deep breath. He drew back his arm that was holding the sword. Looking at Captain who was rushing toward him again, he suddenly raised his arm and held the sword to the sky. Boom! The air was shaking crazily, and the loud sound was like thunder, echoing fiercely in the walls of the air. The rolling thunder spread through the whole forest. A ball of dazzling lightning lit up on the blade of the giant sword and rushed to the sky. The amazing lightning was blooming in the high sky. For a moment, the sky was completely mysterious and dangerous deep blue. There was no lightning in the air, or in other words, the whole space turned into lightning. The deep blue space that filled everyone's sight fell rapidly from the high sky, as if the whole sky was directly pressed down, with a strong sense of destruction. The sword that destroyed the world. The sword that shook the world. Although this strike was still in the scope of a half-step to invincible realm, it was infinitely close to the mysterious invincible realm. All his physical strength was almost sucked out in an instant. All his physical strength, all his sword intent, and the ultimate pseudo-domain. Firmament's eyes became crazy and scarlet, and thick blood flowed down the corner of his mouth. The sword strike that was almost beyond his ability didn't cover the captain's huge body, but he was already seriously injured. The man and the sword became one, and the sword became one with heaven and earth. Heavenly sword of the Wang family of Beihai. The captain's movements suddenly stopped. He raised his head with a rigid expression, looking at the rapidly falling deep blue sky, a bit hesitant. Divine wind. Glacier. Tide. Defense. Hibernation. The moment when the deep blue sky was about to cover the captain with the amazing sword light, a cold roar suddenly rang out. The captain's scarlet eyes and his armor suddenly lit up. Without hesitation he squatted down his huge body, curled up and turned himself into a huge ball. The sword light suddenly arrived and completely covered the captain's curled-up body. The earth shook and the mountains shook. The ground that was as smooth as a mirror suddenly cracked, and countless dense cracks appeared on the ground. A big hole with a diameter of nearly 20 meters appeared where the captain was, and his whole body had disappeared from the ground, and he was blasted into the ground. Puff. Chapter 189. There's one more chapter ahead. 2 chapters in a row. Firmament's expression was still calm, but there was bitterness in his eyes, and even the will to die. No one knew better than him how powerful the sword strike that was infinitely close to the invincible realm was. Under normal circumstances, that sword strike couldn't kill Captain, but the sword he forcibly drove at the cost of being seriously injured was enough to make Captain use up all his energy, and even make his damage reach more than 50%. Once this sword strike was used, Captain would not be able to chase after them in the future, and he could even directly withdraw from the Battle of Changdao this time. But at the most critical moment, someone modified Captain's order and forced him to enter the dormant state with the strongest defense. In this state, not to mention the damage of Captain, the most important thing was that the person who modified Captain's order was now approaching this battlefield quickly. After days of hunting, Captain was finally not alone, and he had a helper. The person who could control Captain's order, even if it was temporary, must have a high status and strength. Captain was unable to fight anymore, but with a strong enemy on the side, he could only continue to escape. Oh, Firmament! A burst of playful and surprised laughter suddenly sounded in the air. 2 figures suddenly appeared in front of Wang Xingxiao and the other 2. Long time no see. I'm really surprised to see you here. Ah, and Ms. Black Pupil. What a surprise. Well, Mr. Wang Xingxiao's strength also surprised me. You're indeed the young heavenly son of Jianghu State. Ah, you 3 look a little embarrassed. If you don't mind, I plan to invite you to Dongdu as guests. I wonder if you have any objections? The lightning fell and dissipated. 2 middle-aged men who looked exactly the same appeared in front of the 3 at the same time. They were 2 extremely handsome men. The weirdest thing was that both of them had waist-length hair and wore kimonos, looking old and gloomy. At this moment, the 2 of them blocked in front of Wang Xingxiao. One of them was smiling and the other looked gloomy. Tide, glacier. Firmament sighed and said blandly, your duty doesn't seem to be to deal with the conflicts in the dark world, does it? Tides, glaciers. These 2 experts who used to be famous in the dark world, could be said to be unknown now. They were also twins, but in today's dark world, the most famous pair of twins was Ice Crystal and Frost Sword of Kunlun City. As for Tide and Glacier, who had already withdrawn from the dark world, no one remembered them. However, Firmament knew their origins. They were the former giants of the Divine Wind Force. 10 years ago they were the left and right commanders of the Divine Wind Force, the second and the third in the Special Warfare Center of East Island. But about 8 years ago, after the two failed to reach the Invincible Realm before the age of 40, they were both disheartened. They left the Dark World and went to the East Island Imperial Palace. They were now the left and right guards of the Mikado. The reason why Firmament knew them was that when the Mikado of East Island visited Beihai Province a few years ago, they met and Wang Tianzong told him about the origin of the brothers. Two half-step Invincible Realm experts. Furthermore, they were twin brothers who shared the same thoughts. The corners of Firmament's mouth became more and more bitter. Even in his heyday he might be able to suppress one of them, but when the two of them joined hands he was absolutely no match for them. And now he was seriously injured and couldn't even hold one of them back. This is East Island. Tide chuckled and said softly with a smile on his face, anything we think is necessary is within our scope of responsibility. Including bullying the weak and catching a junior? The captain of the Kusanagi force hunted him down for half a month without any result, and then you two came here. You really made East Island proud. Firmament said in a mocking tone. Although the captain still has a human mind, in the process of transformation, the sharpness of his mind will inevitably decline. Now he's very stiff. Tide sighed and said with a smile, East Island's current scientific and technological power is far less than that of Jianghu State. If we could also develop something like the Four Spirits armor, we would also choose a real person to lead the Kusanagi force. But unfortunately we can't do that. Firmament narrowed his eyes, forcibly suppressed his serious injury, and started to increase his strength desperately. Tide didn't seem to mind his dying struggle. He continued, in fact if time permits, we don't mind if the captain continues to play with Mr. Wang Xingxiao. Anyway he will be caught sooner or later. But now time doesn't permit it and neither does the situation. You three are too close to Changdao so we came here. His Majesty the Mikado thinks it's not suitable for you three to go to East Island now. On the contrary, the Imperial Palace is the most suitable place for you. Mr. Wang Xingxiao is a very important person we think. He's not the only important one. Gu Hanshan is also uncontactable. You've made a lot of secret deals with Kunlun City in recent years, haven't you? Catching him can also bring you greater benefits. An Ice Crystal Frost Sword has now arrived in East Island. Don't you want to meet him? Firmament calmly interrupted Tide's words. Firmament, are you insulting us? Ice Crystal Frost Sword? What the hell is that? Before Tide could say anything, Glacier, who had a cold expression on his face, took a step forward and spoke in an eerie voice. He wasn't tall and he was wearing a kimono. His waist-length hair made him look even shorter. However, as he walked forward, an extremely eerie killing intent gushed out from him, causing people to subconsciously ignore the fact that he wasn't tall enough. Firmament smiled and didn't say anything. He held the sword hilt tighter and tighter. The sword energy circulated around him and became more and more obvious. He knew why Glacier was so angry. Ice Crystal Frost Sword was famous in the Dark World now, but in fact a few years ago the Dark World didn't have this name. At that time they called it Ice Crystal Sword Master and Ice Frost Sword Master. The word Sword Master had a very special meaning for the Dark World of Jianghu State, because this word had always belonged to Mount Shu in the past hundreds of years. Ice Crystal Frost Sword from Kunlun City called themselves Sword Master, which was obviously a provocation to Mount Shu. As for whether Gu Xingyun, the governor of Kunlun City, planned it or not, no one knew. Because before the series of conspiracies could be carried out, Wei Kunlun, the Nirvana Sword Master of Mount Shu, went straight to Kunlun City and challenged the twin brothers who were at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm at that time. After that battle, the two sword masters became the Ice Crystal Frost Sword of today. Glacier and Tide were both figures of the half-step invincible realm, and they thought highly of themselves. They didn't think they were inferior to Wei Kunlun. He compared Wei Kunlun's defeated opponents with them, which showed his disdain. Ice Crystal Frost Sword is not worthy for us to intercept. Only people like you, Firmament, and young heavenly sons like Mr. Wang Xingxiao are worthy for us to come here. Oh, and Ms. Black Pupil, your eyes are so charming. Maybe they will be more beautiful if we dig them out. What do you think? Tide chuckled and squinted his eyes. He didn't look at Firmament or Black Pupil anymore. His eyes fell on Wang Xingxiao, who looked calm. Well, I think we don't have to waste time. Young Master Wang, are you going back with us? Or are you going to resist? No matter what choice you make, we are very welcome. I can go wherever I want. Now, I want to go to Changdao. Wang Xingxiao said blandly, make way. Good spirit. Tide gave him a thumbs up and praised sincerely, it's a pity that your strength is too low and Firmament is seriously injured. What capital do you have to resist us? Ms. Black Pupil? She's not enough, far from enough. You can try. Wang Xingxiao suddenly reached out his hand and took the giant sword from Firmament's hand, smiling more and more gently. That's not a good idea. Tide shook his head and said seriously, I advise you not to resist. Today we are here. No matter what, you have to go with us. No one can stop us. He really didn't want to fight with Wang Xingxiao. If there was an accident in the battle, more than one heir of the Wang family of Beihai would be killed or injured. For East Island, it meant tens of thousands of square kilometers of land rented by the royal family, which originally belonged to East Island. They can't stop you, but what about me? A soft and cold voice suddenly rang out from afar. A white dot suddenly appeared in the distance. When the voice rang out, the person was still far away, but as the voice fell, he had already appeared next to Wang Xingxiao. He was dressed in white, with an evil face and a cold temperament. A vague but deadly danger suddenly spread in the forest. It was as thin as a needle but extremely sharp. Tide's pupils suddenly contracted. He stared at the man in white who suddenly appeared in front of him and said coldly, Who are you? My name is Daybreak. The man in white narrowed his eyes and looked playfully at Tide and Glacier, who looked like they were facing a formidable enemy. He said softly, You are no match for me. So, they should go back to Changdao with me. Do you have a problem with that? Tide sneered and was about to say something. Daybreak said meaningfully again, A word of advice. If you say something, you will die. The night wind blew. Daybreak's soft tone revealed an indescribable weirdness and coldness, which made people's scalps numb. Are you friends? Tide stared at Daybreak and asked. He had never heard of the code name Daybreak, but he suddenly appeared here, and the vague sense of danger kept stimulating his skin all over. Tide was sure that this man in white with a weird background was at least a superior of the half-step invincible realm, and even if he was a superior of the half-step invincible realm, he should be a top-notch superior. For example, Azure Dragon Gong Sun Chi of Zhongzhou State, Tribulation of Sai City, Saint of Samsara Palace, Firmament of the Wang family of Beihai, they were no match for such a person alone. But once they joined hands, it was hard to say who would win and who would lose. Tide clenched his fist, and the killing intent flashed in his eyes. No. Daybreak shook his head with a smile, but his eyes drifted for a moment. He said blandly, I was entrusted by someone. Someone asked me to bring them back to East Island safely. Who is it? Before Tide opened his mouth, Wang Xingxiao and Black Pupil had asked in unison. Samsara. Daybreak didn't seem to be on guard against a pair of twin brothers of the half-step invincible realm. He looked back at Wang Xingxiao with a smile and said in a soft tone, To be exact, it should be Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan. Wang Xingxiao just looked weird. But Black Pupil and Firmament's faces suddenly changed. Vaguely, they knew that there seemed to be another knot between Li Tianlan and the Wang family of Beihai. Everyone had a reason to save the elites of Zhongzhou State who were in East Island, except for Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan, Tide nodded. He's a very important person. In fact, if he wasn't in Changdao, maybe we would have done something to him. Daybreak couldn't help laughing. In the angry eyes of Tide and Glacier, his expression seemed to be a little sympathetic. You two have good strength, but you can't do anything to him. Really? You. Glacier said coldly. A bolt of lightning had already begun to spread out from his palm. The lightning curled around him, illuminating his entire body with a dark blue color. Of course, not just me. Daybreak looked at Tide and Glacier meaningfully and said softly, Your alertness is too poor. Didn't anyone tell you to pay attention to your back all the time? Behind. Tide's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't move. Glacier had already turned his head around to take a quick glance. He just glanced back and turned around. Then his body shook and he suddenly froze on the spot. About 2 or 3 seconds later, he suddenly turned around again and looked behind him, with an incredible shock on his face. Tide, who had sensed that something was wrong, felt his heart gradually sink. He suddenly pulled Glacier, and the two brothers retreated dozens of meters away. Then they turned around. In an instant, Tide's eyes widened as he stared behind him, dumbfounded as if he had seen a ghost. In the dark forest, the rain was messy and the wind was howling. Everything in the forest was vague and indistinct. Behind the two of them, about 100 meters away, shadows slowly walked out of the blurry darkness one after another. They were in groups. Little by little, the fire lit up, and the hot temperature evaporated the rain curtain and baked the forest. Tide's face was pale and he felt a little cold all over. The figures in his sight were all superiors of the fire-flaming realm. In the darkness, there were flames mixed and connected, and the figures gathered together. Chapter 190. Once the chaos started, it obviously wouldn't stop in a short time. More and more superiors entered Changdao from different channels. The surprise attack on the outer defense line of Changdao on the first day wasn't the end. On the contrary, it was just a prelude. With the arrival of a large number of superiors from the Dark World, there were fights almost every day on the edge of Changdao. All the dark superpowers seemed to have reached a tacit agreement: let East Island bleed first. Even if a large number of elites from East Island were trapped in Jianghu state. Even all the dark superpowers in the world started to gather in Changdao. But it was undeniable that this was still East Island's home ground. In a face-to-face battle, not to mention whether all the superpowers could unite, even if all of them gathered together, they might not be East Island's match. At the very least, even if they won, it would be a Pyrrhic victory, and every superpower would suffer heavy losses, which no one was willing to accept. Right now, most of the elites of East Island gathered in Changdao and set up defense lines around Changdao. How could the superpowers let go of such an obvious target? Almost at the same time, everyone started to attack the special warfare defense line around Changdao again and again. The intensive and frequent raids didn't even give East Island a chance to reorganize. The result of being tired of dealing with them was a real bloodbath and corpses everywhere. On the last day of June, the third day after Li Tianlan woke up, East Island, which had been holding the defense line, finally began to recognize the reality. The defense lines around them all withdrew into the interior of Changdao. The elites of East Island, who had been fighting with the superpowers of the Dark World for a long time, had started to gather and reorganize. Changdao, which had been fighting for many days, seemed to have calmed down, but the undercurrents were getting more turbulent inside. The elites of Jianghu state finally entered Changdao within 72 hours after Li Tianlan woke up, and they had settled down through the special channel of Samsara. Led by the Azure Dragon of Jianghu state, Gong Sun Qi, 600 elites of Jianghu state had also arrived in Changdao. East Island might have noticed it or maybe not. But from the beginning to the end, since the dark superpowers entered Changdao, East Island had been silent. The silent undercurrent was surging in Changdao. Every minute and every second, the city seemed to become more and more depressed. A great battle was imminent, and it could erupt at any moment. The most oppressive and peaceful period before the great battle also became the rarest time for all parties to prepare. The underground organizations seized the time to mobilize their manpower and personally get into the situation to understand the current situation. The elites of Jianghu state were recuperating. The first batch of Jianghu state elites that entered East Island had nearly 2,000 people. After all of them arrived in Changdao, including the second batch of 600 elites, the total number of people was still nearly 2,000, and a lot of them were wounded, which showed how fierce the journey was. East Island, on the other hand, was integrating resources and collecting intelligence. There was no doubt that East Island had the most things to do, but they could do it with the power of the whole country, so they wouldn't be too slow. In the current situation, no matter which side was ready for the war, the Battle of Changdao that the whole Dark World was looking forward to would break out completely. Therefore, everyone was very anxious. Li Tianlan was in a hurry to recover. Since he entered Changdao, this could be said to be the most peaceful period. After his accumulated injuries broke out completely in the Battle of Zhongjing, he had fallen into an unprecedentedly weak state. It had been nearly a week since the Battle of Zhongjing. Many wounds on Li Tianlan's body had healed, but the recovery speed of his internal injuries wasn't ideal. The huge vitality in the Immortality potion could make him recover much faster than others. Together with the daily routine treatment, he only recovered less than half of his injuries in nearly a week. Li Tianlan was very clear about his current injuries. If he wanted to recover completely, it would take at least half a month or even 20 days. The general trend couldn't be changed by his will. Now Li Tianlan could only hope that the final battle could come later, the later the better. The rainstorm that swept the whole of East Island hit Changdao 3 days ago. The crazy rain and the fierce wind raged between heaven and earth. It was midsummer, but there was no heat, so the whole courtyard was slightly cold and cool. In the antique pavilion, Li Tianlan stood quietly, looking down at the clear pool that was disturbed by the rain, with a gentle and calm expression. This was the only water feature in this courtyard. In front of the door of the villa in the center of the courtyard, there was a pool with a diameter of about 20 or 30 meters. The pool was deep, and there were hundreds of ornamental fish of different colors inside. The rainstorm fell messily in the clear pool, and the fish under the water kept surfacing and diving. The whole pool was shaking, full of ripples, but it couldn't turn over, just like Li Tianlan's ambition and desire that couldn't be stopped. The whistling wind took away the last remaining warmth in the pavilion. Li Tianlan, who wore a thin windbreaker, wrapped the lapels of his clothes and then stopped moving. In front of him was the pool, and behind him were tables and chairs. There was a pot of tea on the light brown marble table, and a few teacups were scattered on the table. There were a lot of cigarette butts in the ashtray in the middle. It seemed that not long ago many people had a conversation in the pavilion. But no one knew how long the conversation had ended. The smoke in the pavilion drifted away, and the tea was completely cold. Li Tianlan stood quietly. His heart was restless with the wind and rain, but he looked calmer and gentler on the surface. Another group of fish jumped out of the water and then fell back down. Li Tianlan's eyes, which were very focused most of the time, gradually became unfocused as if he was in a trance. For the past few days he had been healing his wounds, and he was also waiting for the opportunity that he didn't know would appear. It had been almost a month since he came to East Island. Fighting, blood, corpses, storms, fires and thunder filled Li Tianlan's mind. But Li Tianlan still didn't understand the meaning of all this. Jianghu State and Samsara cooperated, and this plan could be described as a national effort, and they were still investing. East Island's special warfare elites were killed and injured, and Jianghu State also paid a big price. But what was the meaning behind all these battles? They killed people, but this was East Island. If East Island didn't perish, what was the point of killing some special warfare elites? Jianghu State and Samsara wanted the right to speak in the dark world of East Island. But now, no matter how he looked at it, Li Tianlan didn't see any possibility of yielding. Why did Jianghu State think that after this battle, these resources and territories of East Island would belong to them? Horsewoman said he would see the answer soon. But Li Tianlan still had no clue. His mind was a little messy. Li Tianlan's imagination ran wild, and his eyes became more and more unfocused. The storm hit Changdao and the pool in front of him. The weather was always gloomy and dark. Time seemed to stay still, and it was already half the afternoon. At a certain moment, Li Tianlan, who was standing quietly, suddenly focused his eyes. At the same time, a gentle and smiling voice rang out. "This place is nice." Li Tianlan's eyes flickered, and he turned around and said blandly, "It's really nice. You can live here if you like." This yard was the central area of the whole clubhouse. It was built in the mountains, and the clubhouse surrounded by mountains was quiet. In this well-protected yard, the quiet atmosphere was aloof from the world. Up close there were lush grass, trees and clear water. From afar there were undulating mountains. This so-called top-end clubhouse in Changdao did have a kind of charm and style that made people forget the vulgar. This yard was arranged by Duke, and Saint didn't object when he saw it. Living in the most distinguished yard in this clubhouse, Samsara wanted to express something simple and complicated. After the elites of Jianghu State arrived in Changdao, Li Tianlan vaguely understood some subtle meanings. There was only one villa in the yard, but Li Tianlan didn't live alone. Several people from East Emperor Palace and Dongqing Rushi lived here for a few days. But most of the time they were either meditating or resting and healing. They didn't have much time to talk. It was almost the same as if he was alone. "Forget it for me." The uninvited visitor smiled, and there was a kind of sincere kindness in his smile, which made it hard to tell whether he was sincere or not. "This is what Samsara did to elevate your status. What's the point of me living here?" He paused, and the smile on his handsome and gentle face was still sincere. He said softly, "If I live here, aren't you afraid that I'll sneak attack and kill you when you're meditating? Will you?" Li Tianlan's tone became calmer. "Why not?" Wang Xingxiao, who didn't hold an umbrella but was still dry and clean, walked into the pavilion. He smiled softly and said, "From the standpoint of the Wang family of Beihai and myself, if I want to kill you, I don't even need to find a reason because there are too many reasons." Li Tianlan looked at him with a faint smile, but his eyes were unfathomable and dead. Wang Xingxiao broke through the siege and came to the club yesterday. Firmament and Black Pupil, who were seriously injured, followed him. Li Tianlan hadn't seen any of them, but he roughly understood what was going on. Samsara rescued the three of them at the most critical moment through the special channel of its partners. In this respect, the three of them all owed Li Tianlan a big favor, or even a life-saving favor. Wang Xingxiao didn't meet Li Tianlan immediately, but he didn't delay too long. After arriving last night and taking a quick rest, the heir of the Wang family of Beihai rushed here as soon as possible. Li Tianlan didn't say a word. He just quietly looked into Wang Xingxiao's eyes. Wang Xingxiao was in a very good state of mind. His face was a little pale, but his eyes were full of energy. He wore a very simple and clean light-colored suit and carried a long box in his hand. Although he said he wanted to kill him, he didn't mean to do it at all. And if I want to kill you, maybe I've already done it? Wang Xingxiao paused for a while and said meaningfully, I'm still alive. Li Tianlan's tone was calm. Facing Wang Xingxiao, his mind was actually a little complicated. But the conversation in this soft voice was not like a meeting between a brother-in-law and his brother-in-law. Li Tianlan, who had recognized the reality, naturally regarded Wang Xingxiao as an opponent, even an enemy. As long as I'm alive, I'll know what you've done sooner or later. Yes, you're still alive. Wang Xingxiao sighed softly, and his tone seemed a little complicated and weird. To be honest, this is what surprises me the most. You're still alive and you saved me once. Is this your kindness to the Wang family of Beihai? He said calmly, I can't be defeated in my life. Wang Xingxiao took a deep look at him and turned to leave the pavilion. Behind him, Li Tianlan tore the paper that recorded the way of heaven into pieces and threw it into the pool. He said flatly, what's the point? After the reconciliation. Enemies were still enemies after all. Why is it pointless? An elegant and calm voice suddenly rang out behind him. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.